On Valentine's Day of 2016, I took my girlfriend out to a nice restaurant for dinner. After we finished, I drove us to the beach because we always liked taking nighttime walks along the shore. The cool breeze, the sound of the waves, and the quiet surroundings make it feel serene and tranquil, but something about that night felt different. I parked the car in a lot that most people don't use because it's far from the pier, the lighthouse, and other popular spots on the beach. This time, I chose this location because it was Valentine's Day, and we wanted some privacy. We backed the car into a spot so we were facing the long road we had driven on to get to this quiet area. The parking lot was a little lower than the road, with a small slope leading down to it. We were enjoying the quiet night while I told them some scary stories I had read online. We had been there for about half an hour when we noticed a truck's headlights on the road above us. At first, I wasn't concerned because I knew that people frequently sped down that road because there were no places for police to hide. But something about the way this truck was moving felt different. The truck was traveling so fast that it appeared to lift off the ground for a brief moment as it approached the parking lot. I told my girlfriend to duck down in her seat and did the same because I didn't want the driver to see us inside the car. At the same time, I grabbed my keys and prepared them in the ignition in case the truck stopped in front of us. My fiancée was obviously anxious, so I attempted to lighten the situation with a joke since I've seen a lot of terrible movies and read a lot of terrifying tales, and I didn't want us to become the next victims in the Lover's Lane saga. She didn't laugh or even react when I told her that some people were merely rushing to get to their Valentine's Day activities. The truck rushed by us, blowing up dust as it went, and it eventually stopped about 50 yards away close to the point where the sand and pavement met, but something seemed strange. Rather than parking correctly, it abruptly stopped at a strange angle, as if the driver hadn't even attempted to straighten it out. The engine continued to run, and the glow of its brake lights could be seen piercing the night. The Bree men got out of the truck and ran straight toward the water, shouting loudly because it was 9 o'clock at night. After a few minutes, everything fell silent again, and my girlfriend and I began to relax. However, less than 3 minutes later, the men ran back to the truck, jumped in, and drove off, just as quickly as they had arrived. My girlfriend and I decided to leave, and we drove away quietly, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. The following day at work, during lunch, I told one of my coworkers about the strange experience. She pulled out her phone to see if anyone had posted about it online, and to my surprise, she found an article about an encounter at that beach, and it was exactly what I had just described. The news article stated that a man was attacked on the HMA pier on Sunday night, and the incident happened around 9:15 p.m. Since the victim was a 20-year-old Oxnard man, it was obvious that the men in the truck were responsible because they fit the description in the article and everything was in order at the time. I didn't call the police because I didn't know much about cars, especially the Mon model, so I couldn't even tell them basic information like the truck's color or type, which made me feel like I couldn't be of any assistance. I also hoped that someone else could provide the information they needed because it was so dark in that parking lot that I couldn't see the men's faces or any other crucial information about them. I assumed that they drove to our parking space and fled to the beach in order to remove any evidence that might connect them to the attack. I had a close friend named Eleanor, and we met during my year 10 studies and quickly became best buds. She had just moved from Sydney with her older sister. Because of family problems, they didn't have a permanent place to stay, so they were living in a small room at a short-term housing place. Eleanor didn't talk much about her family, but I could tell things had been tough for her at that time. My living situation wasn't stable either, and I was sleeping on the couch at my ex's place. Even though Eleanor didn't have much, she let me stay with her, sharing half of her bed. Then, after a while, I made things right with my parents and moved back home, but Eleanor and I stayed very close and spent every day together. When her sister decided to leave the short-term housing and move in with her partner, I asked Eleanor if she wanted to stay with me at my family home. Eleanor said yes and became my roommate. We even kept sharing a bed. This never felt strange to me, as we were already used to being in a small space at the shared house. Now, during that time, I was in a relationship with a man and had been with him for over a year before meeting Eleanor, but because of some problems we lived separately, so she never had to deal with him being in our room. 2 years later, my relationship with that guy was over, but Eleanor was still a big part of my life. We were even still living together the same way. Then, after a while, it turned out that Eleanor and I liked the same guy, but unfortunately for her, he was interested in me. I thought this might be a problem for our friendship, but she insisted it didn't bother her. She even seemed truly happy that I had found a nice guy. We started dating, and I mostly stayed at his place to avoid awkwardness, since I knew Eleanor liked him too, but sometimes he would stay over at our place. When that happened, Eleanor slept in the spare room so we could have the bedroom, and she never seemed to mind. If anything, she became even more attached to me when he wasn't. She even gave me a Valentine's Day ring, which is when things start to get spooky. One night, while my partner and I were sleeping, Eleanor had already packed her belongings and gone to the other room. We had been asleep for a few hours, and it was most likely around 1 or 2 in the morning. The room was completely dark with no light at all. To this day, I don't know what made me wake up, but I'm glad I did. I slowly opened my eyes to the dark room, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure in the darkness. My partner was still asleep, so I grabbed his arm and said, "I think someone's standing by the bed." I turned on the light right away, and he was ready to fight whoever dared to be in the room. To our surprise, when the light came on, we saw Eleanor just standing there. Her only explanation was, "I forgot something." Then she left the room like nothing was strange. She didn't take anything with her. My partner and I were really confused, but our confusion turned into concern when we realized she had just been standing there in silence while we were lying in the dark, wondering if someone was in the room. Then the fear of how long she had been there and what she had done while we were asleep started to worry us. We barely slept that night, waiting for the next day to get more answers. But when the day came, Eleanor was distant. She stayed close to other people in the house, probably to avoid talking about it. She also left to stay with her sister as soon as she could, avoiding any one-on-one time with me or my partner. Less than 2 weeks after that incident, she went to stay with her sister and never came back. I had to take all of her things to a family member because I couldn't reach her at all. I still wonder why Ellen acted so strangely. She had never done anything like that before, and I had known her for years. My partner and I are still together 5 years later, and we both get goosebumps whenever we talk about what happened. It was really strange and scary. When I was 20, I moved to Texas to live with my uncle, and we had an agreement I didn't have to pay rent as long as I helped around the house and looked after my younger cousins. I also found a job at a well-known coffee shop downtown near the busy tourist area. A few months into the job, I had become good friends with my coworkers, and on this day, one of my coworkers was working their last shift. That morning, 3 men had been in the shop. For hours they hadn't bought anything and were just sitting there, but that wasn't unusual for this location. During my break, I walked to a nearby store to buy a farewell card and maybe a small gift for my coworker. As I stepped outside, I put in my earphones, but before I could play any music, I heard the door open behind me. I noticed footsteps following me. Someone caught up and started walking right beside me, matching my pace. When I turned to see who it was, I realized it was one of the men who had been sitting in the shop all morning. He asked for my number, and I politely said no, but he didn't give up. Annoyed, I told him to leave me alone. He stopped and stared at me, shocked. I guess I didn't seem like the kind of person who would speak up or be rude. I kept walking, and when I got back to work, he and the other guys were gone. I told my coworkers what happened, and we laughed about it. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. After that day, he showed up during every shift. Sometimes he was already there when I arrived, and other times he walked in while I was working. Sometimes he brought someone with him, but other times he came alone. My schedule changed a lot. Some days I opened, some days I closed, and sometimes I worked in the middle of the day. But no matter when I worked, he was always there. I started feeling uneasy. I kept noticing him staring at me. He never ordered anything, never talked to me, and luckily didn't follow me. He just sat there. I told my coworkers about it, and they started noticing too. One of my team leaders helped by sending me to the back to wash dishes or organize the cooler. My coworkers also tried to stand in a way that blocked his view of me. I started feeling uneasy at work. When I closed, a coworker would walk me to my car before heading home. If I didn't close, they would still walk me to my car and then go back to work. One day, after weeks of him just staring, he finally walked up to the counter while I was working the register. He ordered a water. I asked for his name for the order, so now I knew his first name, just in case he took his water, and sat down. I had told my manager about him before, but since he hadn't really done anything, there wasn't much we could do except write it down in the manager's book. The next day, I worked with my manager, two other coworkers, and I told them I needed to use the bathroom quickly. There were two bathrooms next to each other, hidden from the coffee bar and register, and they weren't for any specific gender. I walked around the bar to the lobby area, passing his table on the way to the bathrooms. I saw him get up. Before I went inside, I sat down, and while I was in there, someone started rattling the doorknob. I yelled that it was occupied, but they kept rattling the door until I was done. When I opened the door, no one was there. On my way back, I saw him adjusting himself back into his chair. I walked around the bar to the lobby area, passing his table. On the way, I saw him get up and go to the restrooms. I sat down, and while I was inside, someone started rattling the doorknob. I yelled that it was occupied, but they kept rattling the door until I was finished. I was terrified, so I told my boss about it, but he was unable to speak to him because I didn't have any proof that it was him. Later that shift, the man got up and took a coffee from the pickup area. My boss assumed he had ordered it, so he let him have it. I told him it wasn't his, and that his name wasn't even on the cup. My boss used this opportunity to warn him that if he did something like that again, he wouldn't be allowed to return. The man apologized and complied with the rules. After that, it was Valentine's Day, and I was supposed to stay late on specific Thursdays to thoroughly clean the store. He was peeking through the window with both hands pressed against it on one of those nights when we were almost done and I had to clean the bathrooms as one of the last chores. His eyes were wide and he was staring at me intensely. I froze for a moment, just staring back, when I noticed a purple foam heart on one of his palms pressed against the window. He didn't move it at all. I freaked out and ran back into the bathroom, screaming for help, but Hannah could hardly hear me because of the loud music we were playing. Hannah was the team leader and knew how afraid I was of him. Hannah yelled, "What are you saying?" as she approached the restroom. As soon as she noticed him, I reminded her that he was there and was observing me. She then began yelling through the window, You need to leave. If you don't leave, we're calling the police." I stepped out a little to see if he would leave, but he ignored her and kept staring at me. I quickly stepped back into the bathroom and Hannah kept shouting at him to leave and threatened to call the police. About 5 minutes passed and he realized I wasn't going to leave until he did, so he finally left. The next day my team leader and I told my manager that I wanted to file a police report. He told me to wait until he talked to his boss. When I got home, a friend convinced me to call the police, so I texted my boss and told him I didn't care what he or his boss said. I was scared and I was going to file the report anyway, so I dialed 911 and gave them a quick summary of what happened. They told me they were going to send officers to my house to take the official report. The 2 officers were really nice and supportive. I told them the whole story, including how my boss didn't think it was serious enough to call the cops. Since I wasn't hurt, the officers told me I should have called right away and defended me. I thanked the officers and they told me that if he shows up again I should call 911. A few months later, when I felt safe again in downtown, I went out for a walk with some friends. We were close to my place of employment when I noticed him, so I quickly ducked into a small store. My friends followed me, and I told them I saw him, so they kept an eye out. After he was out of sight, we left the store. This occurred when I was around 13 years old. My family and I were on vacation in Cancun with my parents, brother, and 5 of my cousins and their parents. During the day, we did our own things, but at night, we all gathered at the resort for dinner. On Valentine's Day, one of the adults stayed at the buffet to chat, while the children spent the rest of the evening by the pool. I left my candy in the hotel room where my family was staying. After dinner, I was hanging out with my brother and cousins by the pool. 2 of my cousins decided to return to their room to get their candy, and I thought it would be entertaining to join them. Their room was just next door to ours on the same floor of the hotel. The hallway was quiet and we all walked together, but one of my cousins needed to use the bathroom, so I waited for them outside in the hallway. While I was waiting, I saw a man walking up and down the hallway. He was tall, or at least he seemed tall, as I was a short 13-year-old. He was bald, and might have had some facial hair, but I'm not sure. He was wearing a shirt that looked like one my dad has from the band the Eagles. It was gold and white, or maybe gold and black, but I don't remember it clearly. He kept walking up and down the long hallway of the hotel, pacing back and forth. I was standing near the door waiting for my cousin on his 3rd lap. He said hi to me as he passed by and I just nodded back, feeling a bit weird. He didn't stop, just kept walking like it was normal. On his 4th lap, I noticed from a good distance that he was holding a drink in his hand. It looked like a beer or something like that. I swiped my key card to unlock the door and was about to step inside my room when I turned around and saw him standing right behind me. I had only taken a couple of steps into the room and my hand was already on the door handle to close it. He was standing so close that if I shut the door I would have been stuck in the room with him. He wasn't fully inside, but he was close enough to make me feel trapped. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything, but somehow I managed to ask in a calm voice, "What are you doing?" Even though I sounded calm, I was terrified inside. He just stared at me. I felt frozen for a moment, but then I quickly decided to shut the door. As soon as I pushed, I felt him press back, trying to keep it open. I didn't say a word, and neither did he. I leaned my body weight against it, not stopping. Even when I heard the door lock automatically, I stayed there for a few moments, still pressing against the door, making sure he couldn't get in. I stayed calm and called my mom, trying not to cry even though I really wanted to. While all of this was happening, my cousins were still in the other room. After I shut the door, they came out and thought I went downstairs to the lobby to wait for them. A lot of other things happened with my dad and his cousin trying to find the man, but I stayed in the room waiting for my mom. It's a more complicated story than I'm sharing, but I'm only telling my part. About 15 minutes later, while everything else was going on and my family was in the lobby all worried about me, the man was eventually taken downstairs by hotel security, who immediately began questioning him. As for the background, the man had actually stolen a walkie-talkie from the hotel security. When my parents arrived, the man was still standing there, and my mom was telling me everything while we were in the lobby. My dad then approached the man who was still being questioned by security and asked, "Did you go into my child's room?" The man simply stared at him and didn't respond, and without saying anything more, he turned to the security guard and instructed them to handle the situation. The man was eventually escorted out of the building, and my parents remained near me to make sure I was okay before we returned to our room. The cabin had been my wife's favorite place, nestled deep in the forests of Maine. It was where we spent summers, birthdays, and countless quiet weekends away from the chaos of life. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a porch that faced the lake. But it was hers, and by extension it became mine after she passed away 2 years ago. I stopped going. The memories were too strong. I couldn't sit on that porch without hearing her laugh, without seeing her curled up in her favorite chair with a book. I couldn't walk by the lake without imagining her skipping stones or pointing out some bird she'd spotted. The cabin felt like her, and her absence turned it into a painful reminder. But now at 42, I felt I had to go back. It wasn't a sudden decision. My therapist had been encouraging me for months to confront the grief head on, to reclaim the things that once brought joy. The cabin doesn't have to be a monument to her absence, she said. It can still be a place of peace. I finally agreed. It was mid-October when I packed my truck with supplies, food, clothes, firewood, and a rifle for safety. The drive took roughly 5 hours, during which the road narrowed as I approached the trees, whose leaves were a mixture of fiery reds and oranges. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun had set and long shadows were cast across the clearing. The cabin appeared unchanged, with the porch sagging slightly, the door's paint peeling, and the chimney covered in moss. But it stood there sturdy and silent, seemingly waiting for me. I parked the truck and unloaded my belongings, and the air was crisp with a subtle scent of pine and damp. The cabin's earth smelt musty, as if it hadn't been let out in years. I dusted the cobwebs away and opened the windows while the fire in the ancient stone fireplace crackled. That first night, I had a hard time sleeping because of the deafening stillness. I felt tight with every timber creak and leaf rustling outside. I wasn't used to being alone in a place so remote. Still, I stayed. The next day I decided to keep busy. I chopped wood, cleaned out the gutters, and prepared a loose step on the porch. As the sun climbed higher, I ventured down to the lake. The water was colder than I remembered, and the forest seemed thicker, wilder. It was late afternoon when I noticed something strange. About 200 yards from the cabin, in a patch of trees near the edge of the property, I saw a rope tied to a branch. It wasn't there. Before I was sure of it, it looked old, frayed, and weathered, as if it had been there for years, but I knew it hadn't. I walked over to investigate. The rope was tied in a loop hanging from a low branch. Beneath it, the ground was bare, as if something heavy had been dragged away. My chest tightened. Could have been kids messing around, or a hunter leaving a snare. Still, it unsettled me. That night, I locked the doors and kept the rifle within arm's reach. Over the next few days, more things began to feel off. I'd wake up and find the cabin colder than it should have been even with the fire going all night. I found footprints near the back door too large to be mine pressed into the damp soil. One afternoon I came back from the lake and found the porch light on. I hadn't turned it on by the fifth day. I was on edge. The peace I'd come to find had turned into a gnawing paranoia. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was projecting my grief and fear onto the place, but deep down I didn't believe it. That night I sat in the living room staring at the fire. The rifle was propped against the couch outside. The wind howled, making the trees swaying and moaning. I was ready to go to bed when I heard a gentle tap at the rear door. I paused, and when it came again, louder, my pulse raced. I quickly grabbed the rifle and slipped through the little window toward the door. I couldn't see anything. I swung the door open, aiming the rifle at nothing but darkness. The forest was silent. I shut the door, bolted it, and stayed up the rest of the night listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things, quickly loading them into the truck. As I went to grab the last bag, I saw something on the porch, a single muddy handprint smeared across the railing. I didn't stop to think. I threw the bag into the truck and sped down the dirt road, the cabin growing smaller in the rearview mirror. When I got back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. I checked the locks on every door and window twice before going to bed. Weeks passed, but I couldn't forget the cabin. I considered selling it, but couldn't bring myself to let it go. It wasn't just hers, it was ours, but I knew I couldn't go back, not alone. Last week I got a call from the sheriff's office. In the nearest town, a couple of hikers had gone missing near the area. They'd found their car parked on the main road, but no sign of them in the woods. I didn't tell them about the rope or the handprint. I didn't mention the knock at the door or the footprints behind the cabin, but I couldn't help wondering if they were connected. Now every night I dream of the cabin. I see the rope swaying in the wind, the muddy handprint on the railing, and the dark forest beyond. I wonder if it's still waiting for me, if whatever was out there is still watching, still lurking, and I wonder if I'll ever be able to let it go, or if it will let me. It was early October 2023, and the leaves were exploding with hues of orange, crimson, and gold. I thought that taking my dog Scout on a solitary vacation to a distant cabin in northern Minnesota would be the ideal way to escape the bustle of everyday life. The cottage was leased online. It was marketed as an off-grid refuge with no Wi-Fi and no self-service, and guests were captivated by the prospect of being surrounded only by nature. Only me, Scout, and the forest. After a quick trip from Chicago, I arrived in Duluth, and the cabin was roughly a 4-hour drive away. I had leased a beat-up Jeep at the airport, which was ideal for the bumpy gravel roads leading to the cabin. After a number of incorrect turns and anxious backtracking, I eventually located the driveway, a barely perceptible dirt path marked by a weathered wooden sign that read Haven Wood. Scout, a devoted German Shepherd mix, sat in the back seat with his head out the window and his ears flapping in the wind as we drove deeper into the woods. The roads narrowed and the trees grew denser until eventually the GPS lost signal and I had to rely on the printed directions the cabin owner had emailed me. Surrounded by towering pines and birches and their reflections, the cottage itself was rustic but comfortable, including a pitched roof, a little porch, and huge windows that looked out over a peaceful lake. After unpacking, I took Scout for a walk along the lake's edge. The air was clear, with only the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the water. Inside, there was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a propane stove, and a single bedroom with a creaky wooden bed. A lantern was hung by the door, and there was a stack of firewood outside. The first night I constructed a fire and prepared a basic supper on the stove. Scout sniffed everything and his tail was wagging joyfully. It seemed like I had entered another planet. The following morning, I got up early and made the decision to explore the trails around the property. The cabin came with a hand-drawn map of the area that showed a network of hiking paths that wound through the woods. Scout was curled up by the fireplace, his eyes half closed, but his ears twitching at every small sound. Outside, the woods were pitch black, and the silence was so complete that it was almost unnerving. I tried to ignore the slight unease that crept over me as I locked the cabin door before bed. The map was clear enough, and we spent hours walking while taking in the crisp autumnal colors and fresh air. I packed a small bag with water and food, leashed Scout, and started off. The routes were weak, often scarcely more than animal tracks. Around midday, I realized that we had traveled further than ID had intended. The trail had become more difficult to follow, and I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't anything overt, but Scout kept stopping, his ears perked up, and he stared into the trees. When I looked, there was nothing there, so I decided it was time to return. But it wasn't as simple as I had hoped because the forest looked different and I couldn't find the landmarks. Scout began growling deep in his throat, his body taut. It wasn't like him to behave like that. I noticed earlier that the more I attempted to orient myself, the more I twisted around. I held his leash. The last thing I needed was to panic, so I tightened up and tried to remain composed. After what seemed like hours, we finally stumbled back onto the trail. I nearly sobbed when I saw the cabin through the trees. My legs hurt and my throat was dry, but at least we were safe that night. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. The Scout, who was usually full of energy, seemed restless as he paced the cabin and wouldn't settle down. I tried to ignore it, but as night fell, the woods came alive with noises. I tried to sleep, but Scout wouldn't stay still around midnight. He began barking a deep, frantic bark that made my heart race. He was standing by the window, staring into the darkness. I told myself that the rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, and the occasional crack of a branch were all natural sounds, but it felt wrong, like there was something more out there. I took a flashlight and pointed it outside, but all I saw were trees. The following morning, I discovered faint but distinct footprints near the cabin, not animal tracks, but human ones, that led from the edge of the woods to the porch and back again. I tried to convince myself that they were mine, even though I knew they weren't because I hadn't gone near that area of the woods. Scout seemed tense the entire day, refusing to leave my side and growling softly whenever we approached the tree line. I made the decision to stay close to the cabin, only going as far as the lake to get water that evening, barricaded the door with a chair and kept my flashlight. I didn't get much sleep in reach since I could hear every creak and rustling outside. Scout was near the door, keeping his ears open and growling gently any time he heard anything. I decided I couldn't stay another night after discovering something even more unsettling the next day. The firewood pile had been shifted. It wasn't a significant change, but it was enough to make me nervous. I prepared to leave after packing my things and loading them into the Jeep, but the engine stopped after sputtering when I turned the ignition key. I tried again, but it wouldn't start. I was miles from the closest town, had no self-service, no way to get in touch with anyone. The cabin had no phone, and I hadn't seen anyone since arriving. I spent the day attempting to fix the Jeep, but I knew very little about cars, so by evening I was worn out and no closer to a solution. That night, as the sounds outside grew louder, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. By the fourth night, I was at my breaking point, having not slept for days, and the constant fear was wearing me down. Scout was equally tense, barking at every little noise, so I decided to stay up all night. Scout barked frantically, his body pressed against the door. I held a kitchen knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, my heart pounding. When morning arrived, I discovered more footprints, closer this time. Sitting by the door with the knife and flashlight around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, closer than ever. They stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my hand hurt for what felt like an eternity. There was silence, then a single knock echoed through the cabin. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, and then nothing. When dawn broke, I cautiously opened the door. The footprints were there, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. I didn't wait to find out who or what had been tormenting me. I gathered my things, put Scout on a leash, and started walking. It took me nearly the entire day to reach a main road where a passing car finally stopped to help. To this day, I don't know who was out there. The cabin owner claimed not to know anything, and the local authorities found no evidence of foul play, but I know what I felt. I know the fear that gripped me as I sat in that cabin waiting for something or someone to make their move. And sometimes late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. I will never forget the summer I spent at my grandmother's cabin. I was 24 years old and trying to save money and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. My grandma had left behind a cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods and a small family graveyard that dates back to the 1800s. My family couldn't agree on what to do with the cabin since she passed away. Some wanted to sell it, while others wanted to keep it for sentimental reasons. In the meantime, it just sat there, slowly falling apart. When my mom suggested that I spend a few weeks there to clear my head, I reasoned that it couldn't hurt. The cabin was in the Appalachian foothills, close to a forgotten town called Mountain Hollow. It was about 4 hours' drive from my house, so I packed my car with necessities like canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a few basic tools. The journey was uneventful, but as I approached, the roads narrowed and the trees grew thicker. By the time I reached the destination, it was late afternoon, and there were a lot of gray clouds in the sky. A narrow path led to the graveyard, which was hidden by dense underbrush. I unloaded my car and entered the cabin, which looked worse than I remembered. The wood siding was warped and peeling, the roof was sagging in places, and the furniture was covered in dust and sheets. Behind the cabin was a rickety porch with 2 rocking chairs that appeared to have been untended for decades. Moles danced in the faint light coming from the dirty windows. I spent the first few hours sweeping, cleaning, and clearing the cabin. By the time I was done, the sun had set and the cabin felt a little less stuffy. I set up a small gas generator I had brought, which provided me with enough electricity to charge my phone and light up the cabin. Since there was no self-service this far out, I prepared some canned soup for supper and sat down in one of the old armchairs. When I woke up early the following morning, eager to explore, I decided to check out the graveyard first. The path was overgrown, branches snagging at my clothes as I pushed through the graveyard itself, which was small, maybe a dozen headstones, most of them worn and leaning. I recognized a few names from old family stories. The first night was uneventful, and I fell asleep to the sound of crickets. It felt colder than it should have been for late June, but I ignored it and spent the rest of the day cleaning the cabin and cutting wood for the fireplace. That night, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. The cabin was dead silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you. There were no crickets or wind, just an oppressive silence. My grandma was buried there next to my grandpa and a few great-grandparents I'd only heard about in passing. Silence. I put it down to my imagination and made myself sleep for the next few days. But as the uneasiness increased, I noticed little things like a chair that wasn't quite right, a door that I thought I had closed, and faint scuffed marks on the wooden floor that hadn't been there before. The graveyard also seemed different every time I went, and I thought the headstones were moving slightly, though I couldn't prove it. I took pictures with my phone so I could compare them later, but the pictures remained the same. By the fifth day, I was prepared to leave because I had had enough of the strange happenings and the isolation. But when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel, and everything I could think of, but it was dead, so I decided to hike into town to get help. About halfway there, I heard soft footsteps behind me, far enough away that I couldn't see who or what was making them. Mountain Hollow was about 5 miles away, but I thought I could get there and back before dark, so I packed a bag with water and a flashlight and set off. The woods were dense, making the path hardly visible in some places. The rest of the hike was a blur. I walked as fast as I could without going into a full sprint, looking over my shoulder every few minutes. I arrived at the town, breathless and tense, but it was essentially deserted. Most of the buildings were boarded up, and the few people I saw avoided contact. I finally found an old gas station with a payphone. I had stopped straining to hear the footsteps stop too. I called out, hoping it was a hiker or possibly a hunter, but no one answered. The man behind the counter was courteous but aloof, stating that he couldn't leave the station to assist with my car. I called a tow truck, but they told me it would take at least 2 days before they could reach me. I bought some supplies and began the long walk back. As the sun was setting, the woods were even darker than before. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and when I stepped inside the cabin, I knew right away that something was wrong. The furniture was moved, the dust I had previously cleared had returned, and the smell of mildew was stronger than ever. I tried to explain that perhaps an animal had gotten in, or I was having trouble remembering things, but deep down I knew that neither explanation made sense that night, and I barely slept at all. Until the first light of dawn, when I finally plucked up the courage to check. The porch was empty, but the rocking chair was moving slightly as if someone had just gotten up from it. The next 2 days were a nightmare. I heard slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch, like someone pacing back and forth. I didn't dare move, so I just lay there clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. I sipped water and seldom ate. I just waited for the tow truck to come while sitting in the cabin. When the tow truck finally arrived, I practically ran to meet it. The driver didn't ask any questions, and I didn't respond. I never returned to that cabin. My family eventually sold it, and I'm not sure what happened to it after that. However, occasionally late at night, I hear faint footsteps outside my apartment. The footsteps on the porch came every night at around 3 in the morning, and they always stopped just as the sun came up. pacing back and forth through the window. I made the decision to go alone across Norway's woodlands, combining hiking and camping. The view was amazing with tall trees everywhere, thick green moss on the ground, and cold air that felt fresher than anything I'd ever breathed. The plan was simple: hike into the woods, set up camp, and spend a few nights alone away from everything. The first day went smoothly. I walked along a well-marked trail for hours, then turned onto a quieter path that didn't seem to be used much. The deeper I went, the more cut off from the world it felt. By late afternoon, I found a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees and set up my tent. As the sun started going down, a thick fog rolled in, making everything quiet and strange. It felt a little unsettling, but I told myself it was just part of camping in the forest. That night I lay in my tent listening to the forest sounds. First it was relaxing, the wind blowing through the trees, the sound of branches snapping, probably just animals moving around. But then I heard something else, a sharp snap. Much closer this time. I told myself it was just more wildlife. Maybe a deer. Still something felt off. Whatever it was, it sounded heavier than a small animal. I pushed the thought aside and tried to sleep. The next morning I packed up and kept hiking, going deeper into the forest. The fog still clung to the trees, making them seem closer, like they were pressing in. The trail I followed was faint and hard to see, but I kept pushing forward, wanting to stay on track. As the day went on, everything started looking the same, and for the first time I felt a bit nervous. I had a map and a compass, but something didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it. By mid-afternoon I was tired and decided to set up camp again. The spot was a lot like the first one, a small clearing surrounded by trees. As I was unpacking, I noticed something strange, a small pile of rocks stacked neatly near the edge of the clearing. It didn't seem natural. I hadn't seen it when I walked in. Maybe it was just a marker left by another hiker, I thought. Still, it felt odd that it was here, far off the main trail. That night I had trouble sleeping. The wind was louder, and the forest, which had seemed so alive the day before, now felt dead. Sometime in the early morning I woke up to a faint crunching sound outside my tent. The air was so still I could hear my own breathing. The crunching was clear, footsteps, slow steady steps, not rushed, just careful. I froze, listening, trying to figure out how far away they were. They sounded close, way too close. I stayed still, barely breathing, trying to listen for any other sounds, but just as quickly as they had started, the steps stopped. I lay there wide awake for the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I crawled out of my tent. Nothing looked out of place, no tracks, no signs of anyone or anything. But when I looked back at the pile of rocks, my stomach dropped. Some of the rocks had been knocked over, like someone had kicked them during the night. I didn't waste time. I packed up and started heading back the way I came. As I walked through the trail, didn't look right. It felt different, like I was walking in the wrong direction, but I knew I was following the same path. I kept going, trying to stay calm, but after a few hours I had to admit that I am lost. The fog had thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Daylight was fading fast, and my nerves were wearing thin. I kept moving, trying to keep my mind clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. Then, through the fog, I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming from behind me once more. I turned quickly, scanning the fog, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps kept getting closer and closer, almost jogging, but no matter how fast I moved, they stayed with me, always just behind. I stopped, my heart pounding, and I stood perfectly still. The footsteps stopped too. I turned around again, but this time there were only trees and fog, and my head was spinning. Then, through the thick mist, I noticed something moving in the distance, a shadow that was tall and watching, but I couldn't make out its face. I retreated slowly, gasping for air, and this time the shadow seemed to dissolve into the mist rather than footsteps. I don't know how long I ran, but I didn't stop until my legs gave out. When I finally passed out, I looked around and saw that I was back at the first clearing where I had made camp, but the rocks had disappeared. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I got up, I knew I couldn't stay because the forest had no intention of letting me go. The trail was a circle that led me back and back, and I knew that Shadow was waiting somewhere out there, just out of sight, listening to my footsteps. A few months ago, I was sent on a search that still keeps me up at night. Normally, when people get lost, we find them pretty quickly, but this time, something felt strange from the start. I hiked out with 2 other rangers deep into the forest where the ground was rocky, the trees were thick, and the brush was high. It was far from any marked trail, the kind of place most people wouldn't wander into unless they had a reason. I've been a park ranger for years, and while the job can be challenging, it's usually fairly simple. The first strange thing we noticed was how quiet everything was. No wind, no birds, not even the usual sounds of small animals moving around, just dead quiet. It didn't feel right. We set up camp by a small stream that evening, planning to keep looking in the morning. After we ate, I took a short walk along the stream drain, trying to clear my mind. That's when I saw something strange. Big branches broken in odd ways. They weren't just snapped, they were twisted and shoved into the ground. I've seen animals break through branches, but this was different. It was too precise, like it had been done on purpose. The next day we kept moving deeper into the woods. Hours went by and there was no sign of the missing hiker. I started to feel uneasy. Just when I thought we might be getting closer, I saw something on the ground, a boot half buried in the mud. It was old, like it had been there for weeks, not days. The weird thing was it didn't look like it had been worn down by rain or weather. It looked almost fresh, like it had just been placed there. We still hadn't found the man, and something wasn't right. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. The trees looked were growing at odd angles, and I started to feel like we were walking in circles, even though the map and compass said we were on track. The other rangers didn't say anything, but I could tell they were feeling it too. By the time evening came, we found a small clearing where the grass was flat, like something or someone had been lying there recently. In the middle of it was a torn-up backpack, stuff spilled everywhere, candy wrappers, a flashlight, and a map. Still no sign of the hiker. I crouched down to look through the stuff while the others set up camp. I noticed something strange right away. The map had an X drawn on it about a mile away from where we were, but there were no trails or landmarks there. I had a bad feeling, but I couldn't ignore it. We decided to head to that spot first thing in the morning. The next day we pushed on toward the X. The woods grew even thicker and the silence got worse. No sounds at all, just us moving through the trees. Felt like the whole forest was pressing down on us. When we finally reached the spot marked on the map, there was nothing there, just more trees. The whole place felt wrong, like we shouldn't be there. We circled around trying to figure out what the map meant. That's when we saw it hidden between the trees, barely noticeable, was an old cabin. I wasn't expecting to find any buildings out here. There shouldn't have been anything like that. For miles it was run down, almost falling apart. The door was barely hanging on and the roof had caved in, but it was still standing, enough to show someone had lived there once. We walked up slowly. The inside smelled damp, like mold and rot. The floor was covered with broken furniture and the walls were stained dark from years of neglect. But in the corner something caught my eye, a pile of old clothes, boots, and backpacks, all mixed together. I immediately recognized one of the backpacks. It was the same one we had found in the clearing the day before. My heart started racing. The missing hiker wasn't the first one to disappear out here. This place had taken people before, and I had no doubt it would do it again. I felt sick. We were too close to becoming part of that pile. Without saying a word to each other, we packed up fast and left, walking as quickly as we could without running. The woods felt alive, like they were watching us, waiting for us to make a Mistake by the time we got back to our camp the sun was setting and long shadows stretched between the trees. I didn't feel safe until we were well away from that place. We never found the hiker and I never went back to that part of the forest. The higher-ups wrote the case off saying he must have gotten lost and died out there, but I know better. That forest isn't just dangerous, it's like something's hiding and it's something that takes people when they're not careful. I haven't said this to anybody, but sometimes I wonder if the forest intentionally allows people to enter in order to draw more, and when the next one comes, it seems as if nothing occurred. There are particular areas you should avoid, and I don't believe that area of the woods has finished capturing people. I didn't really want to go camping and hiking with my boss and neighbor, Todd, but he persisted in saying that it would be good for us to spend some time together away from work. I didn't know Todd well, but I thought it might be nice to get away from the city for a while. We left early in the morning and headed to a forest, which Todd had been to a few times before, but it was new to me. About an hour into our hike, my phone lost signal. At first, the hike was pleasant, the air felt clean, and the trail was easy to follow, but as we got farther from the main path, something began to feel off. Although Todd seemed to know where he was going, he led us farther into the forest, far from any indication of people. At last, we stopped and made camp in a small clearing surrounded by tall, thick trees. The area was extremely quiet, with only the sound of leaves rustling in the wind and no birds or animals. As the sun started to set, the isolation of the location began to wear on me. It was just Todd and I, miles away from everyone. Focusing on erecting my tent and lighting a fire, I attempted to ignore the strange sensation I was experiencing. Todd had been silent since we arrived at the clearing, and it was beginning to worry me that he was preoccupied, almost as if he wasn't there. The first night passed without anything happening, but the following day things began to get strange. Todd didn't seem to be in a hurry. Instead, he just sat there looking into the woods as if he was lost in thought. I wasn't sure if I should follow Todd when he suggested that we go off the trail to explore a section of the forest that he had been to before, but after a few hours I realized that I didn't know where we were. The trees all looked the same, and it was difficult to remember which way we came from. I became anxious, and every turn we took seemed to lead us deeper into the woods. I told Todd that we should go back, but his calm demeanor didn't make me feel any better. Instead, it made me feel worse. By the time the sun was beginning to set up again, we hadn't seen any signs of the trail or anyone else, and I was beginning to wish I had never come. When we finally stopped to set up camp again, I didn't feel any better. The air was colder, and the trees seemed to press in around us. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were walking slowly and steadily around the camp, and my heart began to race in my chest. I remained motionless, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps circled us. They didn't sound like an animal because they were too heavy. Instead, they sounded like a person. I didn't move because I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. Todd, however, pretended nothing was wrong. He was almost too calm, as if he knew we were safe. Minutes passed, but it seemed like hours before the footsteps began to slowly move away from the camp and vanish into the woods. The footsteps stopped right next to my tent, and I could feel someone standing there just outside the thin fabric. I held my breath, waiting for them to leave, but they didn't move. I was too terrified to look outside for the remainder of the night. The following morning, Todd pretended nothing had happened, packed up his belongings and began walking back to the trail without mentioning anything. I didn't mention his footsteps so as not to make it seem crazy, but Todd's behavior was different. He seemed colder and more distant, as if something had changed in him. The hike back felt longer than before, and every tree rustle made me jump, and my nerves were shot when we finally returned to the parking lot. When we arrived to the vehicles, I was so relieved that I couldn't wait to go and be free of Todd. Something about the whole journey seemed off, and I couldn't get rid of the sensation that he had brought me here for a purpose. Todd smiled oddly at me and expressed his desire that we might repeat this. I feigned a nod at one point, but I knew in my heart that I would never camp with him again. When I returned home that evening, I began unpacking my luggage and taking out my clothing when my wallet dropped on the ground. I stopped there looking at it. My heart is pounding. How did my wallet get up in my backpack when I knew for sure that I hadn't brought it into the forest when I left it in the vehicle before we began the hike? After that, I didn't talk to Todd again, although sometimes in the middle of the night, I can still hear the heavy, plodding footfall outside my window. As has been the case every year since I was a child, my grandfather and I decided to camp out for the night halfway along the trail. We found a small open spot just off the path, set up the tent, and started a fire before the sun set behind the mountains. The hike had been peaceful, but the air felt strange that evening. The forest around us seemed quieter than usual, and my grandfather didn't seem bothered because he had been doing this for a long time, so I didn't say anything. As the night wore on, the fire subsided, and we entered the tent, and I lay there listening to the sounds outside. Normally, the forest would be noisy at night, with crickets, wind, and perhaps an owl in the distance, but this time there was nothing but silence. Hours went by and I couldn't sleep. My grandfather's deep breathing told me he was fast asleep, but I felt uneasy. The air out inside the tent was too quiet, way too quiet. That's when I heard the soft sound of something moving outside just beyond the trees. It wasn't a branch snapping or leaves moving, but a slow, steady crunch. Footsteps. The first I thought it might be an animal, but the steps didn't sound right. They were slow, like someone walking carefully. The steps would stop then start again. Moving in a circle around our campsite, I held my breath, trying to listen as closely as I could. Whoever or whatever it was right outside, moving slowly around us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to wake my grandfather, but I couldn't move. I kept telling myself it was just a hiker who got lost, but the way the footsteps moved, it didn't feel right. The steps got closer to the tent. They stopped right behind my head, and I could hear slow, heavy breathing like someone was standing right there looking down at us. My heart was racing, but I didn't move, couldn't. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped and the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent and back into the trees. I lay there with my eyes wide open, not sleeping for the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose and the light came through the trees, I slowly got up and stepped outside. There were no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. My grandfather stretched, packed up the gear, and acted like it was just another day, but something didn't feel right. We quickly left the campsite and walked back down the trail without saying much. Every few minutes I found myself looking over my shoulder, thinking I might see someone standing at the edge of the trees. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. As we reached the end of the trail, something caught my eye. Carved into the bark of a tree right next to the path was a small mark. It was fresh, something I hadn't Seen when we passed this spot yesterday, a single EX. My grandfather didn't notice it, but I couldn't stop looking at it. To him it probably didn't mean anything, but to me it was a warning, a sign that someone had been out there with us that night, watching us walking around our tent while we slept. As we made our way to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had left that mark wasn't done. Maybe it was just a strange hiker, maybe not. But I couldn't forget how close those footsteps had been, or how long that breathing had hung over me. The X may have simply been the beginning, and I secretly knew that I would see it again soon, although perhaps not as fortunate this time. I had been planning this camping trip for a while with the intention of combining it with a hike in the national park. I didn't want to venture too far into the woods, just far enough to be alone for a few days. I found a good spot by a stream, set up my tent, and decided to explore the area before dark. The trail went through thick trees, and the branches blocked most of the sky. It was quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle in the bushes. The farther I went, the more alone I felt, but I enjoyed it. It was a peaceful respite from the bustle of work and people. By the time I returned to my camp, it was getting dark, so I built a small fire and sat down to eat, taking in the quiet. The night got colder, and once the fire was almost out, I crawled into my tent. I lay there listening to the sounds of the forest, feeling safe in my little camp. But after a few hours, I woke up to a noise. First it was faint, but it sounded like footsteps. They were slow, circling my camp. My heart started to pound. I sat up, trying to hear better. The sound didn't stop. It was soft but clear, crunching through the leaves. I stayed still, hoping it was just a deer or some animal passing by, but the steps felt too slow and careful. They weren't random, and they weren't going away. I unzipped the tent just a little to peek out. The fire had died completely, and everything was pitch black. I couldn't see anything but the dark shapes of the trees. I listened again, but now the footsteps had stopped. It was silent for a while. I tried to lie back down, telling myself I was imagining it. Maybe I was just spooked from being alone out here. Then there was another sound. This time it was the heavy crunch of something stepping on twigs right by my tent. I sat up fast, my heart racing in my chest. The sound was much closer now, moving slowly, like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. I reached for the knife I had in my bag. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to go outside, but I couldn't just sit there waiting. The steps circled my tent again, faster this time. Then they stopped right behind me on the other side of the thin tent fabric. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tight my hand hurt. I listened, waiting for any movement, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were moving away, slowly fading back into the trees until everything went quiet. I didn't sleep at all after that. Every small noise made me jump, thinking the footsteps would come back as soon as the first light of morning crept through the trees. I packed my gear as fast as I could. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to leave on the hike back to my car. I kept looking over my shoulder. There was no one behind me, no sound, no sign of anyone being around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. When I finally got to the parking lot, I felt a little relief, but that's when I saw a footprint in the dirt right next to my car door. It was large, much bigger than mine, and pressed deep into the ground. I stared at it for a while, frozen. The shape of it looked almost human, but not quite right. I packed my belongings into the car and left as quickly as I could. But it wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized something unsettling. The footsteps from last night had stopped behind my tent just before I left. If that footprint was by my car, how long had they been observing me before I even realized that I hadn't returned to the woods? Because I doubt I ever would. I prepared my belongings for the weekend in anticipation of leaving the bustle of the city and going into the woods. In 1968, everything seemed to be changing, but out here, things were straightforward. I sought calm, but instead I discovered something far worse. As night came, I built my camp beside a tiny lake surrounded by tall pine trees, and the fire's flames created shadows on the trunks. I got comfortable and enjoyed the warmth of being by myself, but soon the night was filled with weird quiet and chirping. When I heard a low, distant howl drifting through the trees, I froze. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, and it felt wrong, like a warning. Curiosity nagged at me, so I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. As I walked deeper into the woods, the light pierced the darkness, and the trees towered above me, their branches extending like long fingers. Crickets stopped, and there was an eerie silence that surrounded the area. I tried to ignore it, but all I got was static. My pulse raced with each twig break. After some time, I discovered an old ranger cabin in the middle of a clearing. It appeared to be abandoned, but the door was slightly open, so I cautiously approached. The air felt heavy and uneasy as I stepped inside the cabin, which was empty save for dust and old furniture. A rusty lantern hung from the ceiling, and a map of the area was open on the table. Something caught my eye. It had several spots marked in red search areas. My heart raced, wondering if there had been a search for someone. Suddenly, I heard heavy, slow footsteps outside. I felt a wave of panic. The wood would crumble under me, so I dived behind the table and held my breath, trying to hear the footsteps halt. I waited in quiet, my pulse thumping in my ears, till I heard voices, faint but frantic, approaching. The night was dark and heavy, and I moved quickly through the trees, my heart pounding, as the voices grew louder and more urgent. I looked back, but no one was there. I slowly peered around the corner of the table and noticed flashlights moving outside, their beams cutting through the darkness like hands searching for something or someone. I knew I had to get out. I hurried to my campsite, packed my belongings, and looked around, feeling vulnerable. The howling came closer this time, echoing through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. With my pack slung over my shoulder, I started to hike as quickly as I could, but as I got closer to the edge of the woods, I noticed a group of officers entering the clearing, their flashlights cutting through the brush. I ducked behind a tree and watched as they scanned the area, their faces tense, their eyes darting with purpose. They were searching for something or someone, and I wasn't going to stay to find out what they were looking for. Eventually, I breathed a sigh of relief, got into my car, and drove away, leaving the eerie woods behind. When I looked in my rearview mirror, I believed I saw a shadow flying through the forest, but instead I discovered a sinister secret concealed behind the trees, and I couldn't get rid of the impression that someone had followed me. I increased my speed, but the sensation of being watched persisted. I discovered too late that not everyone who wanders is lost, and not everyone who searches returns. Since I hadn't gone camping with my ex-husband in a long time, we decided to try it again in the hopes that some fresh air would help us reconnect. We found a peaceful area in the woods away from the busy campsites, and the drive there was uneventful, but the silence felt heavy with tension. As night fell, we built a small fire and sat close to it, its flickering light casting shadows on our faces. I tried to ignore the past, concentrating on the crackling fire and the fresh scent of pine around us. Later that night, after the stars had illuminated the sky, I heard a rustling sound, which at first was just a whisper of leaves. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer, but I got up to check, my heart pounding. The trees towered over us, dark and tall, making it difficult to see anything. I moved quietly, straining to hear, and then I saw something. A figure stood just beyond the fire's light, and my heart dropped. It looked like a man, but his face was hidden in the shadows. I looked at my ex-husband, but he didn't seem to notice. Panic rushed through me. I stumbled back, trying to stay quiet, but I kicked a rock. The sound echoed in the stillness. The figure turned, and for a moment I thought I saw its eyes shine in the firelight. I darted back to the tent, breathless and terrified. I shook my ex-husband awake, my voice barely a whisper. He woke up, startled, looking confused. I told him I saw someone. He frowned and grabbed a flashlight. We stepped outside together, the beam cutting through the darkness, but the figure was gone. Only the wind whispered through the trees. We searched the area, but there was nothing. I felt silly for being scared. Maybe it was just my imagination. We returned to the tent, but sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made me jump, and I felt like we were being watched. At dawn, we packed up quickly, the morning light showing the beauty of the woods, but unease hung in the air. As we drove home, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. The trees seemed to close in shadows, stretching unnaturally. That camping trip didn't just bring back memories of us, it reminded me of the hidden dangers that could be lurking in the woods. Even after we left, that sense of dread stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching us. As we drove further away, the woods seemed alive, as if they contained secrets that should be hidden. What if we weren't alone out there? What if that presence had followed us, lurking just out of sight? We might have been trying to reconnect, but the woods showed me something darker, not just memories, but the very essence of fear that creeps in when you least expect it. I remembered the figure in the darkness, and it wasn't just a trick of the light, it felt real. I remembered how the eyes seemed to glint, a reflection of something primal and wild. Knowing that certain areas are best left undisturbed, plagued by shadows that may never fully go away, I took one last look back at the woods. I had been planning this trip for 8 months, and it felt like the ideal way to get away from everything. I parked my car at a small parking area by the trail early in the morning, put on my backpack, and started walking. It was quiet. The only sounds I could hear were my boots crunching on the dirt and the wind blowing through the trees. As the hours went by, I didn't see any signs of people, and finally I found a spot by a stream where I could set up camp. It was peaceful, with only the sound of water flowing over rocks and the occasional bird chirping in the distance. I hadn't felt this alone in a long time, and it felt good. As the day wore on, the sun began to set, and the air grew colder, so I gathered some wood and built a small fire and sat by the flames eating. Just after the sun had set, I heard a faint sound that at first sounded like someone striking something deep in the woods. I felt a little proud of myself for coming out here by myself and managing the silence. Thump, the beat was sluggish. I looked around in confusion, knowing that there shouldn't be anyone else out here and that there were no other campsites for miles. I tried to dismiss it, figuring it might be the wind or an animal moving around, but the sound kept getting louder, and my stomach began to tighten. I threw more wood on the fire in the hopes that the flames would make me feel safer, but the feeling of unease persisted, and then all of a sudden the noise stopped. There was no wind, no crackling fire, nothing, so I just sat there listening intently, but nothing was there. And the woods were dead silent that night, barely slept at all. I was wide awake outside the tent. My heart raced with each little twig crack or creak from the woods. I tried to remain calm, but as I walked, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching me. The strangest thing was that I started hearing footsteps behind me, not constantly, but occasionally, as if someone was walking a little too close behind me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just letting my mind play tricks on me, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as soon as the first bit of sunlight broke through the trees. I packed up my belongings as quickly as I could and started to head back. The air felt different, heavier, as if the woods weren't as welcoming as they had been before. As soon as I started moving again, I would hear the sound of something following, but by late morning, I had to stop and rest because my legs were exhausted and my nerves were shot. I would stop and turn around, but there was nothing but thick trees and silence. I tell myself that this is just my paranoia. I found a small clearing, dropped my pack, and sat down. As I was catching my breath, I noticed something strange on the ground, footprints, fresh ones leading off the trail and into the deeper part of the woods. They weren't mine, they looked human, but the person wasn't wearing any shoes. My skin crawled when I realized what I was seeing. Someone else had been walking out here barefoot. I didn't know how I hadn't noticed them before. I knelt down and saw that the prints weren't coming from the direction I had come from. They were leading the same way I was going, like whoever made them had been ahead of me the whole time. But I hadn't seen a single person since I started this hike. That was enough for me. I picked up my stuff and started moving as fast as I could, not caring about the hike anymore. I just wanted to get back to my car and leave. The woods felt like they were closing in on me, and every step I took, it felt like the trees were watching, hiding something just out of sight. My heart was racing, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I finally made it back to the trailhead and saw my car, I felt a huge sense of relief. I tossed my pack into the back seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it right away. I spent a minute sitting there. I was gasping for air and attempting to relax, but while I sat there, I saw another pair of tracks on the dirt beside my vehicle. My hands were shaking as I started the car, and just before I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed something moving far away in the trees. These were barefoot, the same ones I had seen earlier, but they weren't just in the woods anymore. They led right up to the passenger side of my car, like someone had been waiting there. Being a police officer, I'm used to dealing with stressful situations all the time, so I thought it would be a good idea to spend my days off hiking and camping in a forest not too far from home. I knew the area fairly well, having been there a few times before, so I wasn't too concerned about anything going wrong. A peaceful respite in the woods seemed like exactly what I needed. I parked my car at the starting point of the trail, grabbed my backpack, and headed down the path. The weather was perfect, sunlight shining through the trees, and the trail was empty. Felt like I had the whole place to myself. After walking for a few hours, I found a good spot to set up my camp next to a small stream. It was peaceful with the sound of water running, and I got my tent up without any problems. That first night was quiet. I slept fine. Waking up early to the sound of birds, I spent the next day wandering around, climbing up a hill that had a great view of the forest below. The view was amazing, and being alone gave me some time to clear my head. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was going down, and it was starting to get cooler. That second night, though, something felt off. First, I couldn't figure out what it was, but the feeling just kept growing. I tried to tell myself it was because I was out here alone, and maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, even though I've been in some pretty tough spots at work. Being out here by yourself in the middle of nowhere can mess with your head. As the night got darker, I noticed the forest was a lot quieter than the night before. The usual sound of insects buzzing was gone, and even the animals rustling in the bushes seemed to have disappeared. I tried to ignore it and focused on the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then I heard something, a faint sound like footsteps, coming from deeper in the woods. It was soft, almost like someone trying to move without making noise, but the leaves on the ground gave them away. At first I thought it might be another hiker, but who'd be walking around the woods at this time of night? I sat still and listened. The footsteps stopped and everything went quiet again. When I heard it again, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. This time, the footsteps were closer and moved more slowly around my camp, as if someone were circling it. My heart began to race, and I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my breath, hoping to hear more. The footsteps stopped again, but I knew that whoever was out there was still nearby. It was difficult for me to remain composed when I felt like someone was observing me. I grabbed for my belt, but my pistol was outside the tent with my equipment, so I had two options: stay in the tent and hope it was nothing, or go out there and see what it was. Normally I'm the type to face things head on, but out here without anyone to back me up, I wasn't so sure. I stayed still, hoping whoever it was would just leave. Then I heard the sound again, this time right outside the tent. The footsteps stopped, and I could see a shadow standing just outside the thin fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. Whoever it was, they were too close, and then just like that, they moved away. The footsteps grew fainter until everything went completely silent again. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat up in my tent listening to every little sound, waiting for them to come back. When the sun finally came up, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I wanted to get out of there. Something had been out there last night, and I wasn't about to stick around to see what it was or what it wanted. As I walked back toward my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I was being followed. When I finally got back to my car, I tossed my stuff in the trunk and jumped inside, feeling a wave of relief as I started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there in the trees watching me, but there was no one. When I got home, the feeling still didn't go away. It stuck with me like someone had been watching me the whole time I was out there. Whoever or whatever it was, they knew how to stay hidden. They didn't want me to see them, but they wanted me to know they were there. That's what bothers me the most, not knowing who it was or why they were out there stalking me through the woods. I don't sure I'll ever forget those steady, silent footsteps that are still around my tent. The feeling that whatever was out there that night didn't follow me out of the woods isn't limited to the footsteps, though. Sometimes, when I'm by myself at home at night, I swear I hear the same footsteps slowly and quietly circling, and when I go outside, no one is there, just like in the woods. I'll never return to that forest, but I know deep down that it doesn't matter. After hours of walking, we set up camp for the night. Our setup was simple, with just a few tents, sleeping bags, and a small area marked around us. I had to take the first watch. I sat with my rifle, eyes scanning the dark, which seemed to swallow everything past the little light from our campfire. We were sent on a routine search mission in the mountains, and our group had been instructed to check out an area that seemed suspicious. People were saying that there might be illegal camps hidden deep in the forest, so it was our responsibility to investigate. I started to get tired as the hours passed, but I forced myself to stay awake. At that point, I noticed something strange. The trees that had previously appeared to be thick now appeared to form clear paths, like trails leading deeper into the forest, trails that hadn't been there before, as if someone or something had made them. The forest was oddly quiet, with only the wind blowing through the trees and occasionally the crack of a branch breaking far away. The farther I went, the stranger things became. The trees weren't just forming paths, they looked disturbed, as if something had recently moved through them, snapping branches and leaving deep footprints in the dirt. I grabbed my gear and started walking slowly down one of the paths, just far enough to see where it went. I turned back to camp, but as I walked back, the path seemed to twist, as if the forest was playing tricks on me. The shadows were thicker, the trees now felt like huge walls closing in every direction I looked. The way back seemed blocked by rows of trees that weren't there before. I wasn't lost, but something felt very wrong. I could feel it. Something was watching me. Then I saw it, movement fast and low, darting between the trees. My heart was racing, but I couldn't make out what it was. It didn't seem like a person, but it wasn't an animal either. I gripped my rifle tighter and sped up, trying to stay calm. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just tired, but then I saw more shadows moving in and out of my sight, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I froze as I heard the rustling of leaves, now much closer. Whatever it was quick and silent. I felt like prey being hunted. I pushed through the trees and stumbled back into camp, breathing hard, soaked in sweat. The others were still asleep, totally unaware of what had just happened. I didn't say anything. What could I even say? I didn't know what I had just seen. The rest of the night dragged on, but I didn't sleep. I sat there, heart pounding, rifle in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally came, we packed up our gear and left, but the feeling didn't leave me. As we hiked back down the mountain, I glanced back at the forest one last time. There was no movement now, no strange shadows. But I knew whatever was out there was still there, hiding just behind the trees, watching. It wasn't going to leave. It wasn't finished. It had let us go this time, but it was just waiting for the next time. We came too close, and I knew deep down that the next time none of us would be making it out. It wasn't just watching us, it was planning. Whatever it was, it knew us now. It was only a matter of time. Since my grandmother hadn't been in the woods for years, I thought it would be a good idea to take her on a little camping trip close to a hiking track she used to adore. We discovered a peaceful area far from other campers in the woods, and the route we intended to take was one she often mentioned as having the greatest views. The first day went smoothly. We set up the tent, cooked some food, and she seemed happy. The woods were peaceful, just the sound of leaves rustling from the wind or a small animal passing by. As night fell, the forest got quieter, with only the sound of insects buzzing in the background. Felt calm. The next morning we packed a small bag and started hiking. The trail was steeper than I remembered, and I had to help my grandmother a few times over rocks and uneven ground. Even though it was a bit tough, she was in good spirits, telling me stories about the time she had walked the same trail when she was younger. As we hiked further, the trees seemed to close in around us, blocking out more of the sunlight. Felt like we were walking into a different place, where the forest seemed more alive, more intense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it aside, thinking it was just me being too paranoid. After about an hour, we reached a clearing. It wasn't the one I remembered from hiking this trail years ago, but my grandmother seemed sure it was the right spot. The trees opened up to show a small rocky spot that overlooked the forest below. We took a break, sitting down to enjoy the view, but I couldn't relax. There was something strange in the air, like the whole forest had gone still. Then I noticed something odd in the distance, down in the valley. It looked like a small building, almost hidden by the trees. I didn't remember seeing it before, and it didn't look like one of the cabins or ranger stations nearby. It was too far to see clearly, but something about it felt wrong. It was just a dark shape in the trees, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. My grandmother got up and continued to look at the same area. She seemed abnormally silent, as if she was lost in contemplation, and after a while she gestured for us to return. I didn't dispute the growing intensity of the bad sensation I was attempting to ignore. Even though the sun was still high, the hike back felt longer and the forest appeared darker. Every sound around us seemed louder, like the crunch of leaves beneath our boots or the snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. I kept looking back, thinking someone was following us, but all I could see were the trees and the shadows. We had a sinking feeling when we returned to the campground since our tent was gone. Everything we had left behind was gone. There were no footprints or indications of anybody else around. And the fire pit we had been using was cold as if it hadn't been used in days. Hit me, my grandmother didn't say a word, just stared at the empty space where our tent had been. I tried to think of what to do. There was no way we had been gone long enough for someone to take everything without leaving a single trace. It didn't make sense. With no other choice, we decided to head back to the car, which was parked about a mile away. As we walked, the feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the idea that something was following us, keeping just out of sight. I kept turning around, but there was nothing, just the empty trail behind us. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief, but that relief quickly disappeared when I saw the state of it. The windows were smashed, the tires slashed. It looked like someone or something had gone out of their way to make sure we couldn't leave. We were stuck. I checked my phone hoping for some signal, but there was nothing. The nearest help was miles away, and with my grandmother's health, there was no way we could walk all the way there. As I stood there trying to figure out what to do next, I felt it again, that cold, crawling feeling of being watched. I looked back at the trail, scanning the trees. For a second I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows, but it was gone before I could get a good look. I glanced at my grandmother. She was staring into the woods too, her face pale, her body stiff. She knew something I didn't, something about this place that she hadn't told me. We ended up spending the night in the car, too scared to sleep. Every noise outside felt like it was creeping closer, getting closer to us, but nothing ever happened. Just that constant feeling that something was out there waiting. By morning we had no choice but to start walking, hoping we'd find help somewhere. But deep down I knew we weren't alone in those woods. Whatever had been watching us, whatever had been there the whole time, it wasn't going to let us leave easily. We made it out eventually, but I'll never forget how those woods felt like they were alive, like something was hiding just out of sight, something that had been waiting for us. I still don't know what it was, but I haven't gone back since, and my grandmother never spoke about that trail again. I think she knew we weren't supposed to be there, and I think whatever was out there knew it too. I went camping and hiking with my boss last weekend. It wasn't really something I wanted to do, but he made it sound like I had no choice. I've never thought of him as someone who enjoys the outdoors, but he was really set on showing me his favorite spot deep in the woods. I figured it was a good way to stay on his good side, so I agreed. First, everything seemed normal. We walked for hours along the trail, passing through thick trees and rocky hills. The further we went, the quieter it got. No sounds of birds or anything, and I realized after a while that we hadn't seen another person the entire time. Felt like we were the only two people out there, far from everything. Around noon, we stopped to rest near a small stream. That's when he started acting weird. My boss is usually calm and collected, but now he kept looking around like he was waiting for something to happen. I brushed it off at first, thinking he was just tired, but as we kept going, his behavior got worse. He kept wandering off the trail, saying he knew a shortcut, but it was clear to me there was no shortcut, just more trees. The more I tried to stick to the main path, the more annoyed he seemed to get. The sun was starting to set, and we were still far from the campsite. I knew we should have turned back, but he insisted we keep going. I didn't want to push my luck by arguing, so I just followed him, even though I had a bad feeling. When it got dark, that's when things got really strange. He suddenly stopped in the middle of the trail and just stared ahead. He didn't move, he didn't say anything, he just stood there frozen, looking at something in the distance that I couldn't see. The air felt heavy and everything around us seemed off. I tried to snap him out of it, but he didn't react. His eyes were wide and his breathing was quick and shallow. I looked around, trying to see what he was looking at, but there was nothing, just tree shadows and the dark sky above us. That's when it hit me. We were completely alone, no self-service, no other hikers. It was just me and my boss, and he looked like he had lost his mind. I began to panic because I had no idea how we were going to get back, and he was completely useless. Without saying anything, he turned and started walking again, but this time he wasn't going back to the campsite. Instead, he was moving farther into the woods and away from the trail. I followed him for a short while in the hopes that he had some plan, but it didn't take long for me to realize that he was just aimlessly wandering, not knowing where he was going, and he was walking in daze as if he wasn't really there. I knew I had to make a decision, and every instinct in my body was telling me to get out. I tried calling out to him one last time, but he didn't even turn around. Instead, he continued to disappear into the trees. I turned around and started running. I tried to remember the way we came, but everything looked the same in the dark. The trees felt like they were closing in on me, every direction twisting and turning, no path in sight. My heart was racing as I tripped over rocks and branches, barely able to see where I was going. After what felt like forever, I somehow found the trail again. I followed it as fast as I could, running until I reached the campsite. By the time I got there, it was pitch black. I collapsed by the fire pit, too tired and too scared to think. My boss never showed up the next morning. I left. I didn't wait around. I just packed up my stuff and hiked out of there as fast as I could. When I got back to town, I reported him missing. They sent out search teams, but no one ever found him. It's like he vanished into thin air. I still think about that trip a lot. I can't shake the feeling that my boss knew something was out there, something that had been waiting for him. He wasn't just acting strange for no reason. He was scared, like he knew what was coming. Whatever it was, he walked right into it. He didn't even try to fight it. It's like he knew he wasn't coming back. One weekend, I made the decision to go camping and hiking in order to get away from the bustle of daily life. My neighbor had told me about a trail not far from town that was uncrowded and had some lovely places to camp for a night or two. It sounded ideal, so I packed my belongings and set out early. The trail began easily and was peaceful, with only the sounds of the wind. As I moved more into the woods, the trail narrowed and the trees grew closer together, making me feel alone despite the crunch of leaves under my boots and the odd bird. However, it was exactly what I wanted. After a few hours, I discovered a nice location to pitch my tent. It was a little, concealed clearing with a view of the far-off mountains. I took some time before the sun went down. I was gathering sticks and building a small fire. As night fell, I began to hear sounds coming from the woods. I told myself that it was just the forest animals moving around and breaking branches. But the sounds felt different, more like footsteps, and they stopped when I concentrated on them. I assumed that this was just my mind playing tricks. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and lay there listening to the firecracker. That's when I heard a rustling right outside the tent, like something was moving around. It wasn't far from where I had left my backpack. My heart raced, but I stayed still, hoping whatever it was would just go away. Minutes passed, and the sound faded. I tried to shake it off and sleep, but soon I heard something again. This time it was a clear sound of something brushing against the side of the tent slowly. I reached for the flashlight beside me, turned it on, and unzipped the tent. I expected to see a raccoon or maybe even a deer, but the camp was empty. The fire had burned down, the glowing coals casting long shadows on the trees. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I sat by the fire for a while, letting the light and heat calm me down. The noises stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was just the woods playing tricks. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent and forced myself to sleep. The next morning I woke up early ready to pack up and leave, but something felt wrong. My backpack had been moved not far from where I left it, but enough to make me wonder if I had been careless. Then I noticed something else. The ground near the tent had fresh footprints, not animal tracks, but human shoes. They were too big to be mine, and they circled my tent. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I packed as quickly as I could, feeling the weight of eyes on me all the while, for someone had been here watching me while I slept. When I finally arrived at my car, I experienced a strange mixture of relief and fear, because whoever had been watching me never came out, but they were too close for comfort. I kept hearing sounds from the trees, but I didn't want to stay to find out who or what was out there, so I hurried down the trail, jumping every time a twig snapped. I never returned to that trail because I was afraid that someone would be hiding in the shadows while I slept. Now, every time my neighbor mentions another camping location, I get shivers and find an excuse not to go. The woods are lovely, but they also conceal secrets, and some things should never be disturbed. You can be alone in the woods, but you're never really alone. The sun had already set when I arrived at the campsite, which was deep in Washington State's woods. I had hiked for hours, eager to spend the night alone under the stars, and the air was cool with the scent of pine. After erecting my tent, I lit a little fire with crackling. After a quick dinner, I leaned back on a log and looked up at the sky. The stars sparkled like diamonds, and I felt calm. However, as soon as I heard a rustling in the nearby bushes, I dismissed it, thinking it was just a small animal. When the rustling persisted, my heart began to race, so I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the sound. But all I saw was the outline of trees moving in the wind. I took a deep breath to calm myself, but the rustling persisted, so I decided to go for a quick walk in the hopes that it would help me relax. As I got farther into the woods, I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling that someone was watching me. I headed back toward my tent as the shadows seemed to grow heavier and the trees towered over me like silent sentries, but the route I believed I had. After a few minutes of stumbling through the underbrush, I finally saw a flicker of light from my campfire. Relief washed over me as I hurried back, but when I got there, my stomach dropped because the fire was out and my belongings were all over the place, as if someone had gone through my gear. Fear struck me hard, so I reached for my flashlight and peered about, the beam trembling in my palm, when I heard heavy, sluggish footsteps crunching on twigs behind me. I whirled around, but nobody was there, and the forest seemed alive. Whispering secret, my pulse was pounding, so I huddled behind a large boulder and tried to breathe softly, listening to every nerve in my body on high alert. Then I saw movement in the shadows, like if something was out there that was just out of my line of sight. My thoughts were racing with potential solutions. I had no way of knowing if there was a lost hiker who was trying to hurt me, but I knew I had to leave quickly. I walked back along the trail in silence, staying close to the trees to avoid being seen, and as the footsteps got louder, I forced myself to move more quickly because I didn't want a confrontation. All I could think about was getting to my car at the trailhead, where I would finally feel safe. As I approached the end of the trail, I saw my car in the distance, a familiar sight that gave me hope. I looked back half expecting to see someone following me, but all I saw was darkness engulfing the forest behind me, nothing but trees and shadows. I raced out of the campground after jumping in the vehicle, locking the doors, and starting the engine. The woods were still when I glanced in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't get rid of the sensation that someone or something was still keeping an eye on me from the shadows. As I drove home, I couldn't get rid of the image of the shadow I saw flickering just out of sight. It was like the woods were hiding something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was waiting for its next chance alone in the dark. I realized that nature has secrets, and some of them are best left undiscovered. My heart started to slow once I was back on the main road, but the fear persisted, and I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The rustling footsteps and the sounds of the footsteps felt too real. When I finally got the chance to go, I didn't think twice. I packed light, just the things I needed for a few days, and prepared for some time alone deep in the forest. The first few hours of hiking were just as exciting as I had hoped, with birds and insects making noise all around me. I had always dreamed of hiking through the Amazon rainforest and camping right in the middle of the wildest place in South America. The stories I heard about the Amazon captured my attention, highlighting the dangers, the size of the area, and the strange animals that seemed to live there. I sometimes observed creatures running between the trees, but they were too fast for me to get a clear view. The trees were tall, with their branches covered in leaves, creating a green canopy overhead. Everything was different when I was by myself. I felt as if I had traveled back in time and was cut off from the outside world. In the middle of the day, I saw a tiny open area along a creek and made the decision to make camp there. After setting up my tent and having a short dinner, I strolled around to observe the surroundings. It was difficult to see far because of the dense jungle, but I reasoned that as long as I stayed near the stream, I wouldn't get lost. The daylight began to fade more quickly than I had anticipated, and the air grew colder. I collected some dry sticks and built a small fire to watch the flames as the shadows around me grew longer. That's when I realized something was off. The typical jungle sounds of buzzing insects and rustling leaves, as well as distant animal calls, abruptly stopped. I tried to dismiss it, assuming it was simply the change from day to night, but the silence felt odd, as if something was watching me. I tried to calm myself, but every little sound, a leaf dropping, a tree cracking, made my pulse beat. I searched everywhere, but I couldn't find anything. The firelight only went so far before everything was pitch black. The night dragged on, and I hardly slept. I kept hearing footsteps, breathing, and branches snapping in the dark, but whenever I checked, nothing was there, so I began to question whether my mind was playing tricks on me. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the jungle, but all I saw were dense plants and trees. By morning I was exhausted. I decided to pack up and leave early. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, like something was watching my every move from the trees. I needed to get out of there. I packed up quickly and started hiking back the way I came, staying alert the whole time. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every few minutes I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see something move between the trees, but there was still nothing. By afternoon I reached the point where the jungle began to thin out. I felt a bit more relaxed, but then I saw it deep in the mud along the path footprint, and it wasn't mine. It wasn't from any animal either. It was big, barefoot, and fresh. Whoever or whatever had made it was nearby. I stopped cold, my eyes scanning the trees. I didn't hear or see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. Then out of the corner of my eye, I caught a quick glimpse of movement. Something darted behind the trees, fast, too fast for me to see clearly, but it was Human-shaped, at least it looked human. I didn't stick around to find out more. He started running. The jungle felt like it was closing in on me as I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, but I could hear something following me, its footsteps fast and getting closer. Felt like the whole forest was alive, forcing me out. When I finally reached the edge of the jungle, I was drenched in sweat and out of breath. I stopped, turned around, and looked back at the trees. Even when I left the Amazon and returned to safety, the sensation of being followed lingered in my mind. Nothing moved, and the forest was quiet once again, as if whatever had been pursuing me had vanished. I kept thinking about that footprint in the mud. Whatever had made it had been close, so close, and I realized something terrifying. It had been watching me the whole time, following me, waiting for the right moment. It didn't attack, not because it couldn't, it just didn't want to, and that thought still keeps me up at night. We had been out in the woods for a few days, part of a training mission. The job was to find our way through thick forests and tough ground, camping wherever we could. It was me and 3 other guys, all of us soldiers, all used to roughing it outside, but something about this area felt strange from the start. The forest was way too quiet, no birds, no wind in the trees, just stillness. It made me uneasy, like the trees were watching us, but we kept going, following the map, trying to stay on track. When the sun started to go down, we decided to stop and set up camp near a small clearing. We got a fire going, ate some quick food, and then settled into our sleeping bags under the open sky. I had first watched the hours drag on and nothing happened. It was calm, but that weird feeling still lingered, like something wasn't right. I kept scanning the trees every few minutes, making sure nothing was moving out there. When my shift was over, I woke up the next guy and slipped into my sleeping bag, trying to shake off that unease. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't a deep sleep. I woke up, it was pitch black in the middle of the night, and I had no idea why I was awake, but my heart was thumping in my chest. I remained motionless and listened, only hearing my own breathing, until I gradually sat up, trying not to make any noise, because the fire had burned down to just glowing coals, giving off a weak light. At first, the smell was faint, but I knew it wasn't right. It smelled like blood. The others were still asleep when I turned to face them, but the fragrance was becoming stronger. Then I heard a faint crunching sound, as if someone were gently stepping on dry leaves. I turned my head toward the disturbance in the faint light as my pulse skipped a beat. Just outside the camp, I noticed something move close to the edge of the trees. I couldn't identify it, but I knew that something was there, crouching low and remaining in the shadows. My thoughts were racing, but it wasn't one of the guys. They were all fine, and it wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that. I froze, praying it hadn't noticed me. Just beyond the firelight, the footfall kept going gently around the camp's perimeter. My stomach churned, and I reached for my knife, holding it tight. Whatever it was still out there, getting closer. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet again. I strained my eyes, trying to see what was out there, but it was too dark. I gripped the knife harder, trying to stay calm, but then the smell hit me all at once, stronger than before, like it was coming from everywhere at once. It made my skin crawl. That's when I saw it. One of the sleeping bags was empty. One of the guys was gone. My blood ran cold. How could he have just disappeared without making a sound? I looked around, scanning the ground, but there were no tracks, no sign of him, just that awful smell hanging in the air. I wanted to panic, but I forced myself to stay still, to think we were trained for this kind of thing, to handle danger. But this was different. This was fear like I had never felt before. I didn't wake the others. I didn't know what waking them would do. Instead, I waited for whatever had taken him to make its next move. When the sun rose, the smell had subsided and the forest felt normal again, with birds chirping and the wind rustling the leaves, but our teammate was still gone. The night seemed to go on forever, so I stayed up with my knife in hand, scanning the darkness for any sounds. We packed up in quiet, with that odd, heavy sensation still lingering over us. We didn't discuss what had occurred, as if none of us wanted to acknowledge that it was true, but I knew we all did, and as we left the forest, something didn't set right with me. There was no trace of him anywhere, no blood, no traces. Whatever had taken him was still watching us, as if it was waiting for the proper moment to return, and I couldn't get rid of the sensation. I may never know what it was, but I do know that it could have taken us all if it so desired, and I doubt that we will ever be secure no matter where we go. We're still waiting. My ex-wife Lisa and I used to hike frequently when we were married, so it felt strange to be out here by myself. However, after everything, I reasoned that it might help me decompress. I packed only the necessities and went deep into the woods. The trail wasn't used much anymore, which is why I enjoyed it. The first few hours passed quietly, and the sound of leaves beneath my boots and distant birds reminded me of simpler times. I pitched my tent near a small open area by a stream, a place I knew well, and I planned to hike a little more the following day before heading back. As the sun began to set, the woods became very quiet, which I didn't mind at first. In fact, I liked it, but as it grew darker, I began to feel uneasy because I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen anyone all day. I built a small fire primarily to make myself feel safer, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. Every little sound made me jump, snapping, something moving in the bushes, normal noises, but in the dark, it felt like something was approaching. I kept telling myself that I was just imagining things because I'd been out here before, and I knew the woods could mess with your mind. Time passed slowly inside the firelight, so I finally made the decision to call it a night. I extinguished the fire, went inside my tent, and tried to sleep, but sometime in the middle of the night I woke up because something felt strange. The air was too heavy and still, and the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone was stronger. I remained motionless for a while, listening, and then I heard a faint rustling sound. Outside the tent it was faint, but real. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I reached for my flashlight as quietly as I could. When I turned it on, the light filled the tent. I heard the rustling again, even closer now, right outside. I knew I had to see what it was. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The light landed on something. No, person was standing a few feet away, just at the edge of the clearing. My stomach dropped. I didn't know who they were, but they were staring straight at my tent, not moving. They had been there a while, just standing there. I froze, gripping the flashlight so tightly my hand hurt. Who just stands there in the middle of the night in the woods? They didn't move, they didn't make a sound, they just stood there watching. I could barely breathe. Without thinking, I slowly zipped the tent back up, my heart racing. I sat there frozen, not sure what to do next. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't hear anything, but I knew they were still out there waiting. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there staring at the tent wall, listening. When the first light of dawn finally showed, I slowly unzipped the tent again, hoping the person was gone. The clearing was empty, but the grass where they had stood was flattened. I hadn't imagined that they had been there, right there, just watching me. I packed up as fast as I could and left that campsite behind. Without looking back, I didn't care about the rest of the hike. I just wanted to get out of there. I never went back to that trail. I still don't know who that person was or why they were there. Maybe they were just passing through, but the way they stood there watching me without saying or doing anything wasn't normal. I think about that night sometimes, the way they didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Sometimes late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stay out there longer. I'd been out camping alone for a few days, trying to clear my head. I coming to this remote spot whenever I needed some quiet. It was a long stretch of forest where hardly anyone ever came. The trail ran through thick trees and over steep hills, and it was so quiet it felt like the rest of the world didn't even exist. That's what I liked about it. But after 2 nights, I started getting this feeling in my gut like something was off. It was that kind of feeling you can't put your finger on, but it makes you uneasy. At first it was small, like a shift in the air. I figured it was just me being alone for too long. When you're out in the woods for days, it's easy for your mind to start playing tricks. Still, the feeling stuck with me. Like something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just nerves. Maybe I wasn't used to being so far away from everything for this long. On the third day, I decided to hike to a river nearby to get more water. The trail was as quiet as usual except for the sound of birds, the wind, and the leaves crunching under my boots. But as I got closer to the river, I noticed something weird. A small piece of red cloth was stuck on a branch, torn and moving in the wind. It didn't seem like it belonged here, like it was out of place. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh in the dirt, and they weren't the kind you'd expect from another hiker. These were heavy and deep, like someone had been running the LED away from the river straight toward my camp. My heart started racing. I stood there for a second, frozen. By the time I returned to my tent, I discovered that my tent had been torn open. My belongings were all over the place, like someone had gone through it. Nothing had been taken, and everything was destroyed, as if someone was trying to send me a message. I was not alone out here. Someone had been walking around, and I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. I followed the tracks back to my camp as quietly as possible, trying to step lightly, but the strange feeling in my stomach grew worse, and I couldn't get rid of the thought that whoever had left those footprints was still around. The trees felt darker, even though the sun was still up. I stood there, the weight of what was happening finally sinking, and this wasn't an animal. It wasn't just some careless person passing through. Someone had found my camp and wrecked it while I was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed what I could, threw it into my pack, and started moving fast. There was no way I was staying out here another night. As I hiked back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. The feeling of being followed clung to me no matter how fast I walked. By the time I made it to the parking lot where my car was, the sun was starting to set. I was exhausted, my nerves were shot, but I felt a bit of relief when I saw my car still sitting there. I threw my bag into the back seat, ready to get out of there as fast as I could. Just as I was about to start the car, something caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, a police car was parked at the far end of the lot. At first I thought it was just routine, maybe checking on the area, but then I noticed something strange. The driver's side door was open and there was no one inside, no sign of anyone around. I got out of my car and slowly walked toward the police car. The closer I got, the worse the feeling in my stomach became. When I reached the car, I looked inside and saw something that made my blood run cold. There was blood on the driver's seat, not old dry blood. This was fresh, just a few feet away. The dirt was all messed up, like there had been a struggle. My heart started pounding, my mind racing. I had no idea what had occurred, but I knew I had to get out quickly, so I turned to go back to my vehicle. But before I could get it, I saw a person standing still in the woods just beyond the parking lot, partially obscured by the darkness. They were watching me, but I couldn't tell who they were. They didn't move or make any noise. They simply stood there and stared at me. My body froze, and my thoughts screamed for me to go, but I couldn't take my eyes off of them. The air seemed heavy, as if the world had stopped moving. I finally snapped out of it and bolted from my car. I jumped and slammed the door and sped down the dirt road as fast as I could. Not looking back, my heart was racing the whole way home, and that feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Even after I made it back, I kept expecting to see that figure standing in the shadows, just waiting for me to let my guard down. It's been weeks since that day, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm not done with whatever was out there. Every time I step outside, I Get that same gut feeling I had in the woods. The police never found anything, and no one knows what happened to the officer who drove that car, but deep down I think I know something, or someone was out there watching, and I have a feeling they're not done watching me yet. I took my grandmother camping for the first time. She wasn't really into being outside much, but I thought it would be a nice break for her. We found a quiet spot by a lake with thick trees. All around it was peaceful, with the kind of silence you only get far from the city. After we set up camp, Grandma wanted to go for a short walk, so we grabbed our things and started walking into the trees. The path was narrow and the trees were so tall that they blocked out most of the sunlight. The deeper we went into the woods, the less we could see of the lake behind us. As we walked, I started to feel something wasn't right. The woods weren't just quiet. They felt strangely still. No birds, no wind in the leaves, just dead silence. Felt like the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. We had been walking for about an hour when the path abruptly split into a few different directions. There were no signs or anything to tell us where to go, so I didn't want to worry Grandma, but I wasn't sure which way we came from. We tried a few different paths, but each one led us deeper into the woods. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling persisted, and even Grandma, who never really got scared, seemed to be looking around a lot more than usual, as if she was feeling it too. Nothing looked familiar, and the lake seemed further and further away. The sun was starting to go down and long shadows stretched out across the trees. I tried to stay calm, not wanting to freak Grandma out, but inside I could feel a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Every trail we took seemed to circle back or lead us into more trees. It was like we were stuck in some kind of endless loop with no way out. As it got darker, I started using my knife to mark the trees, hoping to leave a trail, but even those marks seemed to vanish after a while. No matter where we turned, we were trapped. The weird silence was everywhere, and now the darkness was closing in fast. I decided we should stop and wait until morning. Maybe with some light we'd be able to figure out where we were. We sat down next to a big tree, trying to save our energy. The cold started to creep in, and I tried to push away the feeling of being completely lost. I had never felt so helpless before. Sometime after midnight, I heard its footsteps, slow, steady. I initially thought it might be another camper or someone hiking late at night when I heard footsteps in the trees behind us, but then they stopped. I listened intently to hear where they went, but all I could hear was a heavy, suffocating silence. A few minutes went by, and I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard them again, this time closer, and realized that whoever was out there wasn't just passing by, they were following us. I remained still in the hopes that they would just disappear, but they did not, and the footsteps stopped once again just beyond the trees. I was unable to see anything in the darkness, but I knew that someone was keeping an eye on us while we waited. Neither of us slept after that, and occasionally the footsteps would return, pausing before they could approach us too closely. It seemed as though they were testing us in some strange game, but it wasn't an animal, it was something else. After what seemed like hours, we finally found a path that led back to the lake, but even then, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were being watched. I didn't feel safe until we got to the car and started driving far away from that place. Something with a plan. As the first light of morning began to shine through the tray, the footsteps stopped for good. I stood up, my legs hurting, and knew we had to leave as soon as possible. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but it wasn't an accident. Felt like something had been waiting for us, something real, something dangerous. I never told Grandma about it, and she never asked to go camping again, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear those footsteps, steady, slow, getting closer. I never look out the window. Something tells me it's better if I don't. Last summer, my stepsister Clara and I decided to escape the city and go camping in the mountains. We both liked hiking, so we chose a trail known for its beautiful views and moderate challenge. We planned to camp overnight and hike back the next morning. We got to the trailhead late in the afternoon and quickly set up our camp. The sun was setting, creating long shadows on the forest floor. The sky turned a deep orange and the air grew cooler. After dinner, we sat around the fire roasting marshmallows and enjoying the quiet of the woods. As night came, the forest grew silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves. We went to bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep before our hike. Clara fell asleep almost instantly, but I had trouble. The silence felt unsettling, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard a faint noise outside the tent. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart raced. I nudged Clara, but she was sound asleep. I listened intently in an attempt to locate the source of the noises, which seemed to be surrounding our camp. I then slowly unzipped the tent using my flashlight, which shone through the darkness to reveal only trees and shadows. My mind raced with fear, but I knew I had to do something. I slowly unzipped the tent again, the zipper making a loud sound in the still night. I shone the flashlight outside, scanning the area, and saw a dark shape moving quickly between the trees. My heart pounded, and I had to shake Clara awake. I listened intently, but I saw nothing out of place, so I went back inside to try to calm down. The footsteps had stopped, and just as I was about to fall asleep again, I heard something heavy brushing against the side of the tent. We hurriedly packed our belongings as quickly as we could, breathing in short, panicked breaths, and the feeling of being watched never left us. As we were ready to leave, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadow again, when I noticed a small pile of rocks near our campsite that hadn't been there before. It appeared that someone had carefully stacked them, and my stomach dropped. We hurried back to the trail, moving quickly but carefully, and the eerie feeling stayed with us all the way down the mountain. When we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was just beginning to rise, and we were exhausted but relieved to be back. We never discovered who or what had been circling our camp, but the sight of those rocks and the sense of being watched made it clear that someone or something had been there with us. We never returned to that trail. We were both nervous of camping by ourselves in the woods after the experience. As we departed, I couldn't get rid of the eerie sensation that whatever had been watching us was still out there, waiting for another opportunity. The memory of that night serves as a terrifying reminder of how quickly safety can go in the woods. When I started my solo trek in the neighboring mountains on a cool autumn morning, the air was clear and the sun was casting long shadows over the trees. I intended to camp beside a peaceful lake for the night. The route was once simple and was meant to be serene and far from humans. Meandering gently through the woods, the bright fall colors were amazing, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird. By noon, I reached a clearing where I decided to set up camp. I set up my tent close to the lake, enjoying the calm and the soft sound of water lapping at the shore. As night fell, I started a small fire to cook my dinner. The crackling flames and the warmth were comforting against the growing cold. After eating, I sat by the fire watching the stars come out in the clear sky. It was the kind of night where everything felt perfect until I heard a noise that didn't fit. At first, it was faint, like a soft rustling or shuffling. I thought it might be a small animal, but as the night went on, the noise got louder. It seemed to come from the edge of the forest near my campsite. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal moving around, but the noise kept going, and it wasn't random. It had a pattern, almost like it was trying to get my attention. The tension grew with each passing hour. I couldn't see anything in the dark, and the noise wouldn't stop. Now and then I'd hear a twig snap or a faint thud making me jump. I kept my flashlight close, trying to reassure myself that it was nothing. Serious, finally, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and a sturdy stick for protection and carefully headed toward the noise. I was about to head back when I noticed some unsettling new footprints in the mud near the water's edge. They were big and appeared to have been made recently, and my heart raced as I realized that someone or something had been watching me. The area surrounding the lake was dense with trees and underbrush, and as I approached, the noises abruptly stopped, leaving a heavy silence. I chose not to follow the prince as he led out into the wilderness. My skin crawled at the idea of someone or something concealed in the woods. The eerie silence of the forest and the mystery of those footprints made me realize that sometimes the scariest things are not the ones we can see, but rather the ones that leave us feeling watched and vulnerable. I returned to my campsite as soon as possible, feeling both relieved and afraid. I packed up my belongings as quickly as I could, deciding it was best to leave before it got any darker. As I drove away, the forest gradually vanished behind me, but the fear persisted. Long after I left the mountains, I was haunted by the image of those footprints and the strange noises. It was late September, and the air had just started to turn crisp with fall. My wife Emily and I received an invitation to spend a weekend at a cabin with her sister Megan and Megan's husband Brian. They had recently purchased the secluded log cabin deep in the northern Michigan woods as a weekend retreat, and they couldn't wait to show it off. We hadn't had a chance to visit since they bought it earlier in the year, and the drive was long and winding, taking us farther and farther away from any signs of civilization. The cabin was lovely, although it was an A-frame structure with large windows facing a tranquil lake, its surface reflecting the fiery orange and red hues of the sunset. After a long drive and a full stomach, I was ready to crash. Emily and I took the guest room downstairs while Megan and Brian stayed in the master bedroom upstairs. The first evening was uneventful. We had a simple dinner, laughed over a few drinks, and talked about everything from work to family to random memories from the past. The cabin was cozy with rustic wooden furniture, a stone fireplace, and thick rugs that muffled the sound of footsteps outside the woods, which were silent except for the distant call of a loon from the lake or the distant rustle of leaves. The first odd event occurred through the trees early the following morning. I woke up to discover the guest room window wide open, even though I was positive I had closed it the previous evening. Emily was still asleep, and the air was freezing, and a damp, earthy smell came in from outside. I silently closed the window and locked it, not giving it much thought. Perhaps I hadn't secured it correctly and the wind had blown it open. When we arrived upstairs for breakfast, Megan was already making coffee and Brian was frying eggs on the stove. They were content and at ease, and the aroma of the food and freshly brewed coffee helped me get over my previous uneasiness. After breakfast, we made the decision to have a tour of the property. Brian was excited to show off the paths he had made through the forest and the little pier he had constructed on the lake. The four of us hiked, fished, and even paddled out into the lake in a canoe that Brian had packed. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun had set and the temperature had dropped, and the night had become cold about 2 in the morning. When I first heard footsteps outside the cabin, I assumed they were those of an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but they were heavy and sluggish, as if someone was attempting to move stealthily. Emily rolled over after I pushed her awake, mumbling something. I got out of bed and carefully slipped to the window, peeking through the curtains to see nothing but darkness and the sound of footsteps stopping. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The following morning, I brought it up to Brian and Megan over breakfast, and Megan dismissed it, saying that the woods could trick you, especially at night. Brian joked that it might be a bear, but his tone didn't seem very credible. Emily remained silent, but it was clear that she was uncomfortable. The next day was overcast and colder, so we spent most of the day indoors playing board games and watching old movies on a small TV. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed up to read because the fire had burned down to embers and the only light in the room was from a dim lamp on the side table. I heard footsteps again, this time closer, circling the cabin, and my heart started to race as I tried to hear them. Suddenly, there was a soft thud against the wall just outside the living room. It wasn't a loud sound, but in the stillness of the night, it might as well have been a gunshot. I squatted down beside the window and looked out into the darkness after turning off the light. I was unable to see anybody or anything in the forest since the shadows were lengthy and twisted in the moonlight. Eventually, the noise stopped, and I went to bed, though I didn't get much sleep. The next morning, I made the decision to look about the cabin so as not to wake anyone. I waited until Emily, Megan, and Brian were busy inside, so I walked around the cabin's perimeter in search of footprints or any indication of what might have caused the noise. Near the back of the cabin, I discovered a small worn path that led into the woods. It wasn't one of the trails Brian had shown us. It was narrow and overgrown, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I felt a chill go down my spine, wondering why Brian hadn't mentioned this trail or if he hadn't noticed it. Regardless, I chose not to speak for the time being because I didn't want to ruin the weekend with my developing paranoia that night. Brian grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door, beaming the beam into the darkness as the footsteps returned, louder and more persistent this time, followed by slight scratching noises at the windows that everyone could hear. We remained up for hours, too anxious to sleep, until 4 a.m., when the trees smothered the light and nothing moved. When dawn finally broke, the noises stopped, so we packed up and left. As we loaded the car, I took one last look back at the cabin and noticed a figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible through the trees. It was watching us and wasn't moving. I didn't say anything because I didn't need to, and I could tell by Emily's expression that she had seen it too. We never returned. We never discussed what happened that weekend, but sometimes I still think about the footsteps, the odd path, and the figure in the woods, and I always wonder if we were being watched the entire time or if we were being hunted. Megan and Brian eventually sold the cabin, saying it was too remote for their tastes. When I was 28 years old in 2013, my brother Ryan, a 32-year-old police officer who was known for being among the best in the department, called me out of the blue and asked if I could help him with something important. He told me to pack enough clothes for a few days, sturdy boots, and anything I might need for roughing it in the woods. Ryan was the complete opposite of his job as a graphic designer, and I always admired his courage, even though I thought he could be a little too rigid at times. Knowing Ryan, I didn't ask too many questions, but he promised to explain everything once we met. He wouldn't give me any specifics over the phone. The next morning, I took a car to Brookhaven, a little community tucked away in Washington State's foothills. As we drove for more than an hour on winding dirt roads, the trees grew denser, the air grew colder, and the sky grew darker as thick clouds rolled in. Eventually, Ryan stopped his truck in front of a small, weathered cabin that looked like it had not been used in years. The location was remote, with no self-service and no neighbors, just miles of forest in every direction. Ryan met me at a gas station on the outskirts of town, but he was not in uniform, which was unusual for him, but he still had the same serious expression on his face. Ryan said that after he unpacked his belongings, I saw he had brought a large duffel bag, a gun, and what seemed to be military gear. That's when I realized this was no ordinary camping trip. At last, Ryan clarified our purpose for being here. He had been investigating a drug trafficking ring in the area, and the suspects had been hiding their supplies in isolated cabins like this one to evade detection. His team had raided multiple locations, but one important player, a man named Derek Mills, a violent fugitive with a history of eluding law enforcement, had gotten away. When I asked Ryan why he needed me, he explained that he couldn't send any other officers because the department didn't have the resources to send backup for such a remote location. He needed someone he could trust to watch his back, which didn't exactly calm me down, but I didn't want to let him down. We settled into the cabin, which was as rough as it looked. Inside, there were bare bones, a couple of old CS, a rusted stove, and a dusty table. There was no electricity, and the only source of light was an oil lantern. The air was moist and chilly, and Ryan had dragged in a mildew odor. Ryan put up his equipment, which included a police radio and surveillance equipment. He also demonstrated how to use binoculars and a basic first aid kit in case I wasn't sure what I had committed to, but I trusted Ryan. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. The only sounds were the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustling of leaves. The first night was uneventful, and we took turns keeping watch, with one of us sitting by the window while the other tried to sleep. By the second day, I was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. While Ryan was outside checking the perimeter that afternoon, I heard a strange noise, faint footsteps that were almost imperceptible, coming from the woods behind the cabin. My heart raced, so I grabbed the binoculars and looked through the window. Ryan's seriousness didn't help either. He rarely spoke and his eyes were always scanning the tree line. He told me Mills was dangerous and had a history of ambushing officers who underestimated him. I didn't see anything at first, but then I saw a figure darting between the trees. When Ryan came back inside, I told him what I had seen, and he checked his rifle right away. He told me to stay inside while he went out to investigate. I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told me not to. He was gone for almost an hour, and when he finally came back, he said he hadn't found anyone, but he had seen fresh footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin that night. The temperature dropped below freezing, and the wind howled through the trees, making it even more difficult to concentrate. At midnight, I heard those faint footsteps again, and this time they were closer. I nudged Ryan awake, and he grabbed his rifle, and we both stared out the window scanning the darkness. Ryan motioned for me to keep low as he crept toward the door. He opened it just enough to peek outside but didn't step out after a few tense moments. There was a loud bang on the side of the cabin, followed by silence. My heart was thumping so hard that I thought it might burst. He then closed the door and whispered that nothing was there. The following day, we discovered deep scratches on the wooden walls of the cabin, as though someone or something had been scratching at them. Ryan dismissed the marks as being caused by an animal, but I wasn't sure if they were intentional or dangerous. By the fourth day, we were both tense because the food we had brought was running low and I was beginning to feel lonely. But Ryan seemed even more determined. He thought Mills was close by, waiting for the ideal opportunity to attack. That night, as the sun went down and the woodland fell into darkness, the tension grew intolerable. In an attempt to surprise Mills, Ryan placed a tripwire attached to a flare around the cabin's perimeter around 3 in the morning. After the flare went off and the cabin erupted into red light, Ryan snatched up his gun and walked out the window, gesturing for me to remain still. When I heard a gunshot and saw him approaching slowly with his flashlight piercing the darkness, my stomach fell, and I hurried to the window in a panic to find out what was going on. Ryan ran back toward the cabin and yelled for me to lock the door. He then burst inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it. His face was pale, and his breathing was ragged. He told me that Mills had been armed and that he had managed to wound him, but that Mills had fled into the woods for the rest of the night. Ryan decided it was too dangerous to stay, so he radioed for backup, but the signal was weak, and told me to pack up our belongings while he kept watch. As we were loading the truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold: Mills' footprints leading directly up to the back door of the cabin. He had been watching us, possibly even listening to us, and now he was out there, wounded but still dangerous as we drove away. The forest seemed to enclose us, the shadows lengthening with every mile, and I couldn't get rid of the thought that Mills was still out there, observing and anticipating his every move. On the journey back, Ryan didn't say much, but his quiet said a lot. This wasn't over, not for him, not for me. As I lay in bed at home that night, unable to sleep, I realized that Mills was still out there and that Ryan would not stop until he was apprehended. Every rustle of the wind outside and every creak in the house made my heart race. I came to the realization that the true fear wasn't just in the forest, but that someone like Mills could be out there waiting for the right opportunity to strike. We were sent on a routine training mission in the mountains when I was in the Austrian army. It was supposed to be a few days of hiking and camping to get used to the difficult conditions. The higher we went, the colder it got and the paths became more difficult to walk, but it wasn't too much for us to handle. One evening, we set up camp on a rocky hill that was far from any village or road. We were exhausted from hiking all day, so we lay down to try to get some sleep before the next day's march. The night was freezing, and the wind was loud as if it were whipped through the mountains, but there were no other sounds that struck me as strange. Normally, even in the wild, you hear something: branches cracking, leaves rustling, but here it was just the wind and nothing else. The view was breathtaking, but something about the quiet felt off. The camp was simple, with just a fire pit and our gear piled up nearby. I awoke. I'm not sure why, but something seemed strange in the middle of the night. The fire had gone out, and the cold was getting closer. I listened carefully, hoping to hear anything, but all I could hear was the wind. For a long time, I laid there. Wide awake staring at the inside of the tent, my heart was racing though I didn't know why. Then I heard a soft crunch of gravel just outside the tent, slow, steady, like someone walking carefully trying not to be heard. I froze. No one should have been out there. We were all exhausted and everyone had gone to bed. The steps circled the camp, deliberate and quiet. It wasn't the wind and it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too slow, too controlled. I stayed still, barely breathing, hoping it was just one of the guys, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The steps were too cautious, too precise. Whoever or whatever was out there knew we were here and didn't want to be seen. Hours seemed to pass before the sound finally faded, the footsteps slowly disappearing into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The cold seemed to tighten around me and the dark felt endless. I wasn't alone. The next morning I could see the same fear on everyone's faces. No one said a word about it, but we all knew something wasn't right. We packed up fast and got moving, trying to shake off the unease. The plan was to hike further into the mountains and set up camp again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I kept looking behind me, scanning the trees and rocks. The mountains felt heavy, like they were closing in on us, as if the whole place was aware of our presence. That night we set up camp again, but it wasn't any better. Once more I heard the footsteps, slow, steady walking around the camp. No one moved. We all just sat there, barely breathing, listening. The steps stayed just outside the light of our fire, like whoever was out there knew how far to stay back to avoid being seen. By the third night we couldn't take it anymore. The tension was too much. None of us slept. We sat near the dying fire, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling us, moving with the same unnerving slowness, but this time I realized it wasn't just one set of steps. There were several. They were closing in, little by little, step by step. When morning finally came, we didn't talk about it. We packed up and started down the mountain without a word, ending the exercise early. We didn't care about the plan anymore. We just wanted to get out of there. Even as we made our way down, that feeling of being watched didn't go away. It followed us all the way down the mountain. Even when we reached the trees and the familiar landscape, it was still there. Something was watching us. We didn't stop until we were back at the barracks. I've been on a lot of hikes and training missions since then, but nothing like that. I don't know what was out there, but something followed us through those mountains. Something real, something alive. We never saw it, but I know it was there, watching us, stalking us, and whatever it was, it didn't stop when we left. I still think about those nights, the silence and the footsteps. I can't explain it, but I know it wasn't human, not an animal either, but it was out there tracking us, waiting for something, and I can't shake the feeling that one day it'll follow me again. I chose a location further into the woods for my solo camping excursion in 1978. Very far away. I've always enjoyed being in nature, and this place seemed to be the perfect way to escape the city's noise. The hike to the campsite took most of the day, and the trail wasn't in great condition. It was covered in weeds that were barely visible in some places. I had to consult my map more than I had anticipated, and by the time I found a small clearing to set up camp, the sun was already setting. I pitched my tent and built a small fire, and the trees surrounding me were dense, making it feel as though I was isolated from everything else, with only the wind. I felt completely alone through the leaves and a few birds calling in the distance, which was exactly what I wanted. As night fell, everything became darker than I had anticipated, with no city lights nearby, the stars hardly illuminating the sky, and the trees surrounding me looking like black shadows. The only light I had was the fire, and I sat there eating a simple meal while gazing at the flames. At first, it felt peaceful, just the fire and me, but after a while, I noticed that the birds and the typical sounds of the woods had stopped. The crickets and leaves had ceased their movement, and all was quiet. I reasoned that it might simply be the woods getting ready for the night, but it still felt weird. Then, I heard a faint, distant snap, like a twig breaking, and immediately recognized it. I sat up and looked into the darkness, but the firelight didn't reach very far beyond it. Everything was black. I reasoned that it must be an animal, possibly a deer, but the silence didn't feel right. Even when animals are nearby, the woods aren't this quiet. I put a few more logs on the fire in the hopes that the light would help. For a short while, it helped, and I felt like I was relaxing again. After a few hours of listening to the fur crackle, I made the decision to attempt to sleep by laying in my tent, where I could still feel the silence. I heard it again, closer this time, and then the sound of leaves crunching beneath my feet. It wasn't loud, but it was too deliberate to be the wind, so my heart began racing, and I sat up listening intently. It was closer this time, and I didn't want to leave the tent, so I unzipped it just enough to get a glimpse. Every little sound felt loud, including my own breathing, the wind outside the tent, and the last remnants of the fire slowly burning out around midnight. The fire was almost extinguished outside, with only a few glowing embers, and I could barely see anything in the dim light, but I could still hear the sound of someone cautiously approaching my campsite. I froze, barely breathing, hoping that whatever it was would move on, but it kept getting closer and closer until it was right at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel that something was out there just beyond the fur light, standing still, watching, and I didn't dare make a sound, so I just sat there, waiting for whatever it was to do something, but nothing happened. The night fell silent once more, with no footsteps or rustling leaves, only the sound of the woods and the dim glow of the fire. The next thing I knew, the sun was up and the woods were alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves again. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. I stayed up for hours, too afraid to sleep, just listening, until finally my exhaustion overcame me and I must have passed out. Eager to get out, I hastily packed my belongings and was folding my tent when I saw something in the mud close to the clearing's border. They were not my footprints. They came from the woods and stopped exactly where I had heard the noises the previous evening. It felt like someone had come out of the trees and was watching me while I slept. My heart was racing as I gathered the rest of my belongings and hurried back down the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched the entire way back. I looked around, but I didn't see anything, so the feeling persisted throughout the hike. When I finally reached my car, I threw my belongings in and drove away as quickly as I could, my hands shaking the entire time, half expecting to see someone or something following me. I've never gone back to that campsite. I've never camped alone since then. The idea that someone stood there silently watching me while I was out in the middle of nowhere still makes my skin crawl. But the worst part, I'll never know if they were planning to do more than just watch. Maybe next time they won't just stand there. Maybe next time they'll get closer. Camping has always been something I enjoy, especially in the quiet places away from everyone. Being a police officer, I really like the alone time. The quiet, it gave me a break from the stress of my job, so when I got a few days off I decided to go hiking and camping in the national forest far away from the city and all its noise. I packed my stuff, put on my hiking boots and headed out by myself, just me, the woods, and the peace I needed. The walk to the campsite wasn't too hard. I had picked a spot deep in the woods away from the regular campsites. I wanted to be alone. After a few hours of walking, I found a small open area that seemed Perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got ready for a quiet night. The woods were calm except for the sound of a few animals moving around. That didn't bother me. I had done this plenty of times before, and it always felt safe. As the sun went down, the woods got darker. I started a fire and sat down to eat. The heat from the flames felt good because the air was getting colder. I stared at the fire for a while, letting the crackling would relax me, trying to forget about the stress of work. Felt good to be away from everything. Around midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure what woke me up, but something did. Maybe the fire had gone out, or maybe it was just too quiet. I lay there in my sleeping bag listening. There was nothing, no wind, no crickets, no animals moving around, just dead silence. I turned over trying to ignore it. It was probably just normal, but then I heard something, a faint sound like something moving outside my tent. It was soft at first, but then I could hear it more clearly. It was like footsteps, slow and careful. I sat up, fully awake now. The hair on my arms stood up as I listened closer. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to care about being quiet anymore. The footsteps were louder now, going around on my tent. It wasn't an animal. These were human footsteps, someone walking slowly, trying not to be heard. My instincts kicked and I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. The light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. I pointed the flashlight around, checking the trees and the shadows, but there was nothing. I stepped out of the tent holding the flashlight tightly, feeling exposed. I scanned the area again, but everything looked normal. The trees were still, the shadows long, but no sign of anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there watching. I sat by the fire for the rest of the night, not going back to sleep. I kept the flashlight close, my back to the tent, staring into the darkness. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. Couldn't relax. I felt like I wasn't alone, like someone or something was out there just beyond the light of the fire. The next morning, I decided to pack up earlier than I had planned. I didn't feel right staying any longer. As I took down the tent, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Just a few feet from where I had slept were footprints, human footprints, clear in the dirt, circling around my tent. They weren't fresh. Either they'd been there, left by someone who had been watching me all night. I've been in some tough situations at work, but this felt different. This wasn't something I could control. Whoever had been out there creeping around my camp wasn't some criminal I could deal with. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. I started the hike back, moving faster than usual. Every time I heard the trees rustle or branch snap, I felt my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. I just felt it. When I finally got to my car, I threw my gear into the back and got in. I didn't look back at the trail or the woods. I just started driving, wanting to get as far away as possible. Even now, I can't forget that night. I've handled a lot as a cop, but what happened in those woods was something else. It wasn't about catching someone or solving a case. It was about something much worse, because whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were watching. They knew I was there and they were waiting. And the worst part, one still don't know why I had been walking for hours the path, going through thick trees and rocky ground. The plan was simple: hike to a far-off spot, stay the night, and head back the next day. The weather was supposed to be clear, and I had enough food and water for the trip. It was just me out there alone with nature, which I usually liked. I found a good spot to set up camp just before it got dark, a small open area surrounded by tall trees. The wind started to pick up a little, making the leaves rustle, but I didn't think much of it. After setting up my tent and getting some food, I sat by the fire watching the flames dance around. The quiet was different from being at home. It felt heavier, more noticeable. Every time a branch snapped or a bush moved, it sounded louder than normal. As the night went on, I got into my tent, letting the fire die down. First, it was peaceful. I listened to the wind and the trees and slowly started to drift off to sleep, but at some point I woke up. I wasn't Sure why at first my heart was racing, pounding in my chest, but I didn't know what had set me off. I lay there completely still, trying to hear something, anything that might explain the feeling of unease creeping over me. Then I heard it, footsteps, quiet, but definitely there, and they weren't far away either. They were close, way too close. Whoever it was, they were moving around the camp slowly and on purpose. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. It wasn't an animal, I knew that right away. The steps were too slow, too heavy for that. I don't know how long I lay there listening. My heart was racing and my hands were starting to sweat. The footsteps would stop for a while, then start again. They moved in a circle around my tent, never going far, like whoever was out there was waiting for something. I thought about unzipping the tent to see what was going on, but fear kept me glued in place. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want them to know I was awake after what felt like forever. The footsteps finally stopped. Everything went quiet again, but it didn't make me feel any better. I'm very certain that I didn't sleep at all after that. As soon as the sky began to brighten, and I simply laid there wide awake, praying that the night would finish and that the morning would rise. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, didn't even stop to eat, and just wanted to get out. As I headed back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the path was empty. When I finally arrived at the parking lot and saw my car, I let out a breath, not realizing that I had been holding. I never went back to that spot again, and I don't think I'll ever be able to, because something was out there that night, and whatever it wasn't just passing through, it was watching, waiting. A few days later, I went online and looked up reports about the area, and that's when I discovered that someone had gone missing while hiking not far from where I had camped, and no one had ever found them. I couldn't stop thinking about it after that, how the footsteps circled my tent, never leaving, almost like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. Whoever or whatever was out there that night wasn't done yet, and I think maybe I was supposed to be next. Last summer, my grandmother and I decided to go camping in some remote hills we'd heard about from friends. It was meant to be a peaceful escape, just us and nature. We got to the trailhead early in the morning and started our hike with high hopes, carrying our backpacks filled with camping gear. The trail was narrow and overgrown. We moved carefully but steadily, enjoying the fresh air and the sounds of the forest. When the sun was high, we found a clearing that was perfect for setting up camp. The spot was lovely, surrounded by tall trees and a small stream nearby. After setting up the tent and unpacking, we decided to take a short hike to explore, or more. We followed a path that looked like it would loop back to the camp, but it soon became unclear and tangled. The forest grew thicker, and soon there were no bird songs or the usual forest sounds. It was unusually quiet, but I brushed it off as just being deeper in the woods. We kept walking, but the trail seemed to take us further from the camp. As evening came, the light faded quickly and shadows grew longer. I began to feel uneasy, realizing we had gone too far. My grandmother, always calm, stayed quiet but seemed worried. Eventually we decided to head back, but the forest seemed different now. Trees that had looked familiar before now seemed strange, and the once clear path was swallowed by darkness. The temperature dropped and the cool air felt freezing against my skin. We used our flashlight to find our way, but it only made creepy flickering shadows on the trees just as panic started to set and we heard something rustling in the bushes. I pointed the flashlight that way, but there was nothing there, just the deepening gloom of the forest. We rushed back, our footsteps echoing loudly in the eerie silence. After what felt like hours, we finally found a landmark. We recognized a large twisted oak tree we had passed earlier. Relieved but exhausted, we followed the direction back to the camp. When we reached our campsite, it was completely dark. The area was using quiet, with no sounds of animals or the stream. We'd heard before we decided to stay inside the tent for the night. Our nerves frayed from the unsettling experience. The darkness outside felt even more oppressive, and every creak of the tent made us jump. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the tent. I was too scared to move, holding my breath. The scratching continued, then stopped suddenly. I peeked outside with the flashlight, but saw nothing, just the blackness of the forest. The air outside felt colder, and the silence was heavy. We packed up quickly the following morning and headed back to the trailhead. As we hiked, the forest seemed to be watching us and hiding something sinister behind its trees. We were glad to be leaving it behind, but we were exhausted. The hike had pushed us to our limits, and even though nothing specific happened, the eerie silence and the unsettling experience had left a deep mark. The forest had a dark secret that seemed to watch us as we left, hinting that it had more to reveal if we ever dared to return. I had been considering going camping alone for a while, so I packed my belongings and headed to the mountains. The hike up was quiet and peaceful, just me and the trail, and the sound of nature surrounded me. Rustling leaves, birds chirping. The sun was still rising when I discovered a pleasant, open area beside a little river that was ideal for putting up my camp after many hours of trekking. Gathering wood for a fire and just taking in the view, everything felt calm, the kind of calm that makes you feel like nothing could go wrong. As the evening went on, the air got cold fast. I lit the fire and sat by it eating some food I brought. The night was clear and the sky was full of stars. It was the kind of night that makes you forget all the noise in your head. After a while, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. A few hours later, I woke up. Something felt wrong. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, just a few glowing bits left. The forest was completely silent. It wasn't the usual nighttime quiet where you can still hear insects or the wind blowing. It was dead quiet. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, listening for anything, but there wasn't a sound, not even the river nearby. That was weird. I should have been able to hear the water. My heart started to beat faster. I realized how alone I really was out there. I slowly sat up, trying to shake off the feeling maybe I was just being paranoid, but then I heard a deep, heavy thud. It sounded far away at first, like something big moving through the woods. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again, but it didn't come. I told myself I was just hearing things, that it was probably nothing. I laid back down, but I couldn't sleep. After what felt like forever, I heard the noise again. It was closer this time, another heavy thud, like something large walking through the forest. I froze, my whole body stiffening. The sound got louder each step. Coming closer to my tent, my heart was pounding in my chest as I listened to the sound stop just outside my tent. I didn't move, I didn't even breathe. Whatever it was huge. I could feel the ground shake slightly with each step it took. The air in the tent felt thick, hard to breathe, like the silence was pressing down on me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it might be: a bear, a large animal like a deer, or something else entirely, but it didn't sound right. The footsteps were too heavy and slow, and the thing began to circle my tent slowly, each step deliberate, as if it was checking me out to see what was going on inside. My heart. I remained motionless for what seemed like hours, staring up at my tent's dark roof and barely breathing, until it stopped right at the entrance. Through the thin material, I could see the faint shadow of something large, but I dared not move. We were sent on a routine training mission in the mountains when I was in the Austrian army. It was supposed to be a few days of hiking and camping to get used to the difficult conditions. The higher we went, the colder it got and the paths became more difficult to walk, but it wasn't too much for us to handle. One evening, we set up camp on a rocky hill that was far from any village or road. We were exhausted from hiking all day, so we lay down to try to get some sleep before the next day's march. The night was freezing, and the wind was loud as if it were whipped through the mountains. but there were no other sounds that struck me as strange. Normally, even in the wild, you hear something, branches cracking, leaves rustling, but here it was just the wind and nothing else. The view was breathtaking, but something about the quiet felt off. The camp was simple, with just a fire pit and our gear piled up nearby. I awoke. I'm not sure why, but something seemed strange in the middle of the night. The fire had gone out, and the cold was getting closer. I listened carefully, hoping to hear anything, but all I could hear was the wind. For a long time, I laid there, wide awake, staring at the inside of the tent. My heart was racing, though I didn't know why. Then I heard a soft crunch of gravel just outside the tent, slow, steady, like someone walking carefully, trying not to be heard. I froze. No one should have been out there. We were all exhausted and everyone had gone to bed. The steps circled the camp, deliberate and quiet. It wasn't the wind, and it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too slow, too controlled. I stayed still, barely breathing, hoping it was just one of the guys, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The steps were too cautious, too precise. Whoever or whatever was out there knew we were here and didn't want to be seen. Hours seemed to pass before the sound finally faded, the footsteps slowly disappearing into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The cold seemed to tighten around me, and the dark felt endless. I wasn't alone. The next morning I could see the same fear on everyone's faces. No one said a word about it, but we all knew something wasn't right. We packed up fast and got moving, trying to shake off the unease. The plan was to hike further into the mountains and set up camp again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I kept looking behind me, scanning the trees and rocks. The mountains felt heavy, like they were closing in on us, as if the whole place was aware of our presence. That night we set up camp again, but it wasn't any better. Once more I heard the footsteps, slow, steady walking around the camp. No one moved. We all just sat there, barely breathing, listening. The steps stayed just outside the light of our fire, like whoever was out there knew how far to stay back to avoid being seen. By the third night we couldn't take it anymore. The tension was too much. None of us slept. We sat near the dying fire, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling us, moving with the same unnerving slowness, but this time I realized it wasn't just one set of steps. There were several. They were closing in, little by little, step by step. When morning finally came, we didn't talk about it. We packed up and started down the mountain without a word, ending the exercise early. We didn't care about the plan anymore. We just wanted to get out of there. Even as we made our way down, that feeling of being watched didn't go away. It followed us all the way down the mountain. Even when we reached the trees and the familiar landscape, it was still there. Something was watching us. We didn't stop until we were back at the barracks. I've been on a lot of hikes and training missions since then, but nothing like that. I don't know what was out there, but something followed us through those mountains. Something real, something alive. We never saw it, but I know it was there, watching us, stalking us, and whatever it was, it didn't stop when we left. I still think about those nights, the silence and the footsteps. I can't explain it, but I know it wasn't human, not an animal either, but it was out there tracking us, waiting for something, and I can't shake the feeling that one day it'll follow me again. I chose a location further into the woods for my solo camping excursion in 1978. Very far away. I've always enjoyed being in nature, and this place seemed to be the perfect way to escape the city's noise. The hike to the campsite took most of the day, and the trail wasn't in great condition. It was covered in weeds that were barely visible in some places. I had to consult my map more than I had anticipated, and by the time I found a small clearing to set up camp, the sun was already setting. I pitched my tent and built a small fire, and the trees surrounding me were dense, making it feel as though I was isolated from everything else, with only the wind. I felt completely alone through the leaves and a few birds calling in the distance, which was exactly what I wanted. As night fell, Everything became darker than I had anticipated, with no city lights nearby, the stars hardly illuminating the sky, and the trees surrounding me looking like black shadows. The only light I had was the fire, and I sat there eating a simple meal while gazing at the flames. At first, it felt peaceful, just the fire and me, but after a while, I noticed that the birds and the typical sounds of the woods had stopped.